I only have $3, sir. The girl's voice was so soft. Ethan Whitmore turned from the long table of wrapped gifts and saw her standing just inside the iron gate of Street Mary's children's home. One small hand stretched toward him. In her palm lay 3 wrinkled bills. They were folded so tightly, so carefully. Ethan stared at the money, then at the child. The kids here need it more than I do, she said, lifting her hand a little higher. Please take it. Please use it for them. Ethan lowered himself slightly, trying not to frighten her. What's your name, sweetheart? Annie, she said. Annie, he repeated. Do you live here? She shook her head and glanced over her shoulder toward a small house beyond the fence. No, sir, I live over there with my mom. Sister Margaret, the elderly director of Street Mary's, stepped closer. Her silver hair was tucked beneath a dark wool hat. That's Annie Carter, Sister Margaret said quietly. She lives next door. She often stands outside the fence and watches the children play. Annie's cheeks darkened with embarrassment. She started to lower her hand. But Ethan held up his palm gently. No, you're not in trouble. He looked at the 3 bills again. Annie, where did you get this money? Annie pressed her lips together as if she had practiced the answer, but was still nervous to say it aloud. $1 from my mommy. She gave it to me because I helped fold towels at the laundromat. 1 was from Miss Ruth next door because I carried her grocery bag when her knee hurt. She paused and looked down. And 1 I found by the bus stop. Mommy said we should wait in case somebody came back for it. Nobody did, so she said I could keep it if I used it for something good. A soft murmur passed through the volunteers. Ethan's voice became even quieter. And you wanted to use all $3 for the children here? Annie nodded. Yes, sir. How did you think $3 would help them? She looked toward the orphanage children. A little boy near the porch steps held a red toy truck against his chest, but his eyes were fixed on the gate. Not the gift. A girl in a pink hat hugged a stuffed rabbit like she was afraid someone might take it back. 2 younger children stood close to Sister Margaret, watching Annie with solemn curiosity. I don't know, Annie admitted. Maybe socks or soup or crayons, she swallowed. Mommy says $3 isn't a lot, but it's not nothing. Ethan felt the words move through him slowly. $3 isn't a lot, but it's not nothing. He shook his head gently. Annie, I can't take your money. Her eyes widened. Ethan tried to smile kindly. You keep it. We brought gifts today. We have trucks full of things for the children. You don't need to give me your $3. But instead of looking relieved, Annie looked almost frightened. No, sir, she said quickly. Please. Ethan blinked. Please. She stepped closer, still holding out the money. Please take it. It's all I have. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. Annie's voice trembled, but she kept going. I know it's only $3. I know you have more. I saw the trucks and the boxes and all the people listening to you. She glanced down at her shoes, then forced herself to look up again. But I stood outside the gate because I wanted to give it to you myself. If I put it on the table, maybe nobody would know it was for them. Ethan looked toward the gate. The iron bars were cold and dark, the kind a child might grip while waiting for courage to come. One of the church volunteers, a woman in her 60s with a red scarf tucked under her chin, stepped forward. Her eyes were wet. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. That child's been standing out there nearly half an hour. Annie looked down. The volunteer continued. I thought she was waiting for a parent or maybe just watching the party. But she never took her eyes off you. She kept holding that little fist in her pocket like she was scared she'd lose what was in it. Another volunteer, an older man carrying a box of blankets, nodded. She didn't come for a toy. Didn't ask for cocoa. Didn't ask for anything. Just waited by that gate. A woman from the neighborhood added, baby girl came all this way for $3 because $3 is what she had. Sometimes you got to receive a child's gift, sir. Not because you need it. Because she needs to know her heart was heard. Ethan said nothing. Annie lifted her hand again. Please take it, she whispered. The kids need it more than me. Ethan's assistant, Olivia, standing beside the media table, gave a short, nervous laugh. $3, she said, trying to sound light, trying to pull the moment back into something manageable. That's very sweet, honey, but $3 won't exactly change an orphanage. Ethan turned. His face changed so quickly that Olivia took a half step back. Don't, he said. Olivia blinked. Ethan, I only meant, number. His voice sharpened, low, but filled with anger. Don't you dare laugh at a child for giving everything she has. Ethan's eyes stayed on Olivia. Do you understand me? Not one more word like that. Not here. Not in front of her. Not in front of children who have already learned how little the world thinks they're worth. Olivia's face went pale. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt her. I know you didn't mean to, Ethan said, his voice still hard. That's the problem. Too many people hurt children without meaning to, then expect that to make the hurt smaller. Olivia lowered her eyes. You're right. I'm sorry. Ethan turned back to Annie. The little girl had pulled her hand closer to her chest. Ethan immediately dropped to one knee on the damp stone path. His expensive overcoat brushed the ground, but he did not notice. He wanted his eyes level with hers. "Annie," he said gently. "You did nothing wrong." Her lower lip trembled. "I made your lady mad." "No," he said. "You made me remember something." "What?" Ethan looked at the $3 in her small hand. "That giving isn't about how much a person has. It's about how much love they put into what they give." Annie looked doubtful. "But it's still only $3. "It may be only $3 to someone who has never gone without," Ethan said. "But to you, it was everything." She nodded slowly. "Then it matters," he said. Annie looked over her shoulder at the children. "I have a mommy," she said. "They don't." Those 5 words struck the courtyard harder than any speech Ethan had prepared. The boy with the red truck looked away. Sister Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. The volunteer in the red scarf began to cry silently. Annie continued, her voice small and honest. "When I get scared at night, Mommy comes. She rubs my back and says, 'I'm right here, baby.' But sometimes I hear Caleb crying from my window. Not loud, just a little." She looked at the boy. Then back at Ethan. "Nobody comes like that for him." Ethan felt his throat close. A tear slipped down his cheek before he could stop it. Then another. Annie's eyes widened. "Sir." Ethan wiped his face, but the tears kept coming. "I'm all right," he said, though his voice broke. "You just gave me more than $3, Annie." She held the bills out again, more carefully this time. This time, Ethan did not refuse. He reached out with both hands and accepted the 3 wrinkled dollars as if she were handing him something sacred. He folded them once slowly and held them against his chest. "I will take this," he said. "Not because I need your money, because I need to remember your heart." Annie stared at him. "So, you'll help them?" "Yes," Ethan said, "but I won't use your $3 to do it. I'll use mine." Her forehead wrinkled. "Then why take it?" "Because you asked me to," he said. "And because everyone here should know that the smallest gift can carry the biggest truth." Sister Margaret stepped closer, her voice thick with emotion. "Children know when love is real, Mr. Whitmore. They also know when adults are only passing through." Ethan looked up at the old brick building. He stood and turned to Olivia. His voice was calm now, but there was no room for argument. "Cancel my flight." Olivia looked up. "Your flight and the dinner downtown. The donors are expecting you." "The children have been waiting longer," Ethan said. Sister Margaret watched him with cautious hope. Ethan turned to her. "After the gifts are handed out, I want to see the rest of Street Mary's. The real rooms, where they sleep, what they eat, where the roof leaks, what happens after Christmas when the cameras are gone." Sister Margaret nodded slowly. "The real rooms are not pretty, Mr. Whitmore." "Then I've spent too long looking at pretty things." Caleb stepped down from the porch and came to stand beside Annie. He did not speak. He simply stood there with his red toy truck, close enough that Annie smiled at him. Ethan looked at the 2 children. One from inside the orphanage and one from the little house next door. A fence had separated them. But Annie had seen across it. She had seen what adults with all their money and meetings had managed not to see. He slipped the $3 into the inside pocket of his coat near his heart. Ethan Whitmore stood near the iron gate, one hand resting against the inside pocket of his overcoat. The 3 wrinkled dollars were still there. He had accepted them from Annie, not because he needed a child's money, but because everyone in that courtyard had understood something in that moment. Refusing the gift would have protected his pride, but accepting it had honored her heart. Olivia Bennet stood several feet away, watching Annie. The little girl had not left yet. She stood near the porch steps beside Caleb, the boy with the red toy truck. Olivia took a slow breath. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "I need to apologize to her," Olivia said. Ethan did not soften immediately. "Yes, you do. I know." She glanced toward Annie again. "I thought I was saving the moment from becoming awkward. That's what I do, right? Keep things smooth, keep things moving, make sure nobody says the wrong thing in front of a camera." And instead, Olivia swallowed. "Instead, I said the wrong thing in front of a child." Ethan looked back at Annie and Caleb. His anger from earlier had cooled, but it had not vanished. It had settled into something firm. "She came here with everything she had. You laughed because it looked small." "I know," Olivia whispered. "And I hate that I did." Ethan studied her for a moment. Olivia was not a cruel person. He knew that. "Then don't apologize to make yourself feel better. Apologize so she knows she was never foolish for giving." Olivia nodded. "I understand." She walked across the courtyard slowly, not with the brisk confidence of an executive assistant, but with the caution of someone approaching a small wound she had helped create. Ethan stayed where he was, watching. Annie looked up as Olivia came near. Caleb pulled his truck closer to his chest. "Hi, Annie," Olivia said gently. Annie's shoulders rose a little. "Hi." Olivia crouched, though not too close. "May I talk to you for a second?" Annie glanced at Ethan. He gave her a small nod. She turned back to Olivia. "I said something earlier that was unkind," Olivia said. "When you offered your $3, I laughed. Should not have done that. Annie looked down at her shoes. It was only $3. No, Olivia said, and her voice caught. That's exactly what I got wrong. It was not only $3. It was all you had. And you were trying to help someone else with it. That was a beautiful thing. Annie's brow wrinkled slightly, as if she was not used to adults admitting mistakes so plainly. You're not mad. Olivia shook her head. No, sweetheart, I'm ashamed and I'm sorry. Annie was quiet for a moment, then she said, Mommy says, sorry means you try not to do it again. A faint broken smile crossed Olivia's face. Your mommy is right, I will try very hard not to do it again. Caleb, who had been listening silently, looked up and said, grown-ups don't say sorry a lot. Olivia turned to him. They should. The boy considered that, then went back to rolling his truck along the porch step. Annie looked at Olivia for another second, then nodded with the solemn mercy of a child. It's okay. Olivia blinked quickly. Thank you. When she stood, she did not immediately return to Ethan. She looked at the orphanage building instead. Really looked at it. The old brick, the cracked paint, the tired porch, the windows where children's paper stars had been taped from the inside. Sister Margaret came down the porch steps with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. The children are going in for supper soon, she said. Mrs. Alvarez from the church made chicken soup. Do they always eat this early? Ethan asked. When food is ready, we eat while it is warm, Sister Margaret said. That is one of the little rules of survival. There was no bitterness in her voice. That made it worse. Ethan turned toward her. You said the real rooms are not pretty. They are clean, Sister Margaret replied. I will say that first because the staff works hard. But clean and sufficient are not the same thing. I want to see them. Sister Margaret held his gaze. Most donors prefer the parlor. I've spent enough time in parlors. She gave one short nod and led him inside. Olivia followed a few steps behind. Quieter now. This is the part visitors see, Sister Margaret said, gesturing to the parlor. The room was modest but warm. A Christmas tree stood in the corner with donated ornaments. There was an old piano, 2 couches covered with quilts, and a shelf of board games missing more than a few pieces. It was not fancy, but it had been arranged with care. Then, Sister Margaret opened a narrow side door. The temperature dropped almost immediately. Ethan stepped into the hallway and felt cold air brush his face. The heat doesn't reach here. Sometimes it does, Sister Margaret said. Sometimes it remembers its age. They entered one of the dormitory rooms. 6 metal beds stood in 2 rows. The blankets were folded. The floor was swept. Each child had a small space, a book, a stuffed animal, a drawing, a pair of shoes lined up carefully beneath the bed, but 2 mattresses sagged. One window had been sealed with plastic. Near the ceiling, a brown stain spread outward from a corner like an old wound. Olivia whispered, "Oh my God." Sister Margaret did not look at her. On rainy nights, we moved the bed from that corner. Ethan walked to the window and touched the plastic sheeting. Cold seeped through it. How long has it been like this? Long enough that the children know where not to put their pillows. They moved to the bathroom next. One faucet dripped. A tile was cracked near the tub. The cabinet held toothbrushes labeled with names, a few bottles of children's shampoo, and a nearly empty box of bandages. Everything was orderly. Everything had been stretched. In the kitchen, Mrs. Alvarez, a round-faced church volunteer with flour on her sleeve, stirred a large pot of soup. She nodded politely when Ethan entered, then returned to her work. The shelves held pasta, rice, canned beans, peanut butter, cereal, powdered milk, and donated holiday cookies. Labels were written in neat black marker. Breakfast, lunch, emergency, use first. Do they have enough food? Ethan asked. Sister Margaret looked at the shelves. They have meals. That isn't what I asked. No, she said, it is not always enough. Not the way growing children need. Fresh fruit goes fast. Milk goes faster. Protein is expensive. Some of our children arrive hiding food in their pockets because they do not trust that another meal will come. Olivia turned away, covering her mouth. The last room Sister Margaret showed them was a storage room. It was carefully organized with winter clothes, school supplies, old backpacks, and shoes sorted by size. The neatness might have looked comforting to someone passing through. Ethan saw something else. There was not enough of anything to be messy. These are the reserves, he asked. These are the hopes, Sister Margaret said. We hope the next child who comes through our door fits the coat we have. We hope no one outgrows shoes before spring. We hope the flu does not come for all of them at once. Ethan looked at the shelves, then back at her. Why didn't anyone send me this list? Sister Margaret's eyes were tired, but steady. Mr. Whitmore, lists have been sent to many people with many offices. Ethan had no defense for that. I don't want later, he said. Sister Margaret said nothing. Ethan turned to Olivia. Tomorrow morning, I want a structural engineer here, a pediatrician, a child psychologist, a nutritionist, someone from our foundation's finance team, and not for photographs. Olivia nodded, her voice still thick. I'll arrange it tonight. No press, Ethan said. No press, she said. And I want a real assessment. Roof, heat, food, medical needs, staffing, education, everything. If a child needs it to grow safely, I want it on the list. Sister Margaret watched him carefully. That will be a long list. Then we'll start at the top and keep going. When they returned to the courtyard, dusk had settled fully. The sky was deep blue and the first lights in the orphanage windows glowed softly. Annie was still near the porch with Caleb, though a staff member had called the children in for supper. Caleb hesitated, looking between Annie and the open door. Go eat, Annie told him. You'll be outside tomorrow, Caleb asked. If Mommy says yes. He nodded and disappeared inside with his red truck. Ethan approached Annie slowly. I saw some of the rooms. Annie studied his face. Are they bad? Some need fixing, he said. Some need a lot of fixing. I know, she said softly. Caleb told me the window makes his blanket cold. Ethan knelt in front of her again. Annie, I'm going to come back tomorrow with people who can help fix those things. You won't forget, she asked. Ethan placed his hand over the pocket where her $3 rested. I won't forget. I have something to remind me. Annie looked at his coat pocket, understanding. My $3. Yes, he said. Your $3. You're keeping them safe. I am. She nodded, satisfied by that more than any grand speech he could have made. Then you have to come back. Ethan felt his throat tighten again. Yes, he said. I do. As he walked toward the small house beyond the fence to meet Annie's mother, Olivia came up beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Behind them, Street Mary's glowed in the cold evening, full of children eating soup, holding new toys, sleeping under old ceilings, and waiting to see whether this grown-up would be different from the others. Finally, Olivia said, $3. Changed the whole day. Ethan looked ahead at Annie's little house where a porch light flickered on. No, he said quietly. $3 told the truth. We're the ones who have to change. The porch light of Annie Carter's house flickered once before holding steady. It was a small yellow bulb above a narrow front door, but in the deepening cold, it looked almost brave. Ethan noticed the cracked walkway first, then the chipped paint along the porch rail, then the little clay pot beside the steps where a dead summer flower still stood in dry brown stems. Nothing about the house asked for pity. It looked tired but clean, poor but cared for, the kind of place where every dollar had a job and every object had been made to last longer than it wanted to. Olivia stopped at the edge of the walkway. Do you want me to come in? Ethan looked toward the window. A curtain moved slightly. Annie had gone inside. Ethan could imagine how that sounded. A billionaire at the door was not always good news. Sometimes money arrived like weather, changing the pressure in a room before anyone understood what it wanted. I think I should speak with Miss Carter first, he said. Olivia nodded. I'll wait here. Ethan climbed the porch steps slowly before he could knock. The door opened a few inches. A woman stood behind the chain lock, one hand on the door, the other resting protectively against the frame. She was young, but exhaustion had drawn fine lines around her eyes. She still wore the pale blue shirt from a laundromat uniform under a gray cardigan, and her hair was pulled back in a tired knot. Behind her, Ethan could see Annie peeking from the kitchen, wide-eyed and nervous. Mr. Whitmore, the woman asked. Yes, ma'am, Ethan Whitmore. He took a step back from the door, giving her space. You must be Miss Carter. Grace Carter. Her eyes moved past him to Olivia at the walkway, then back to his face. Is Annie in trouble? No, Ethan said immediately. Not at all. Grace did not open the door farther. She told me she gave you money. She did. Grace closed her eyes for half a second, as if the weight of a long day had just found one more place to press. Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was going to do that. She's got a big heart, but she doesn't always understand when something might embarrass folks. She didn't embarrass me, Ethan said. She humbled me. Grace looked at him carefully, unsure what to do with that answer. He reached into his coat slowly and took out the 3 folded dollars. She asked me to accept these for the children at Street Mary's. I did. I'm keeping them safe. Grace's face changed. A mix of surprise, worry, and something like grief passed across it. That was all she had. I know. She was saving for crayons. Grace's voice softened and for the first time she looked back toward Annie. The big box. The one with all the colors, not the little pack they sell by the register. Annie stepped out from the kitchen doorway. Mommy, I didn't need them. Grace turned. Baby, we talked about this. I know. Annie twisted her fingers together. But Caleb needs stuff more than me. Grace's expression trembled. She looked like a mother caught between pride and fear, between wanting to praise her child's kindness and wanting to protect her from a world that would gladly take everything soft from her. Ethan said quietly, May I come in for a few minutes? Only if you're comfortable. Grace hesitated. Then she unhooked the chain and opened the door. The house isn't company ready. I didn't come to inspect your house. No, Grace said, stepping aside. But people with money always say things like that right before they notice everything. Ethan accepted the rebuke with a small nod. Then I'll do my best not to be that kind of guest. The house was warm in the way small homes could be warm, even when the heater struggled. Not warm because of money, but because of care. A thrift store lamp glowed beside a worn sofa. A basket of folded laundry sat on a chair. The kitchen smelled faintly of macaroni and cheese, black coffee, and lemon cleaner. On the refrigerator were Annie's drawings held up by mismatched magnets, a sun with a smiling face, a house with a purple roof, two stick figures holding hands under the words, Mommy and Me. Grace noticed him looking and crossed her arms. Self-conscious, she said, she draws when I'm doing bills. Annie came to stand beside her mother, pressing close to her leg. Ethan lowered himself into the chair Grace offered, though he felt too large for the room and strangely out of place. He had sat in penthouse boardrooms overlooking Manhattan, in private dining rooms with governors, in leather chairs that cost more than this family's monthly rent. Yet, this small kitchen made him feel less certain than any of them. Grace remained standing. What exactly happened over there? Ethan told her simply without making it grander than it was. He said Annie had waited by the gate, had offered the $3, had asked him to help the children because she had a mother and they did not. He did not mention the cameras much. He did not mention his tears until Annie did. Mr. Ethan cried, Annie said softly. Grace looked at him startled. Ethan gave a faint embarrassed smile. She's telling the truth. Grace's face softened despite herself. Annie Carter, you made a billionaire cry. Annie looked worried. I didn't mean to. No, baby, Grace said and reached down to smooth Annie's braids. Sometimes people cry when their heart hears something before their mouth knows what to say. Ethan looked at Grace. You raised a remarkable daughter. Grace let out a tired breath. I'm trying to raise a kind one. Remarkable feels expensive. There was no bitterness in it, only truth. Annie climbed onto a kitchen chair and swung her feet. Mommy says being kind doesn't mean being rich. Grace's eyes stayed on Ethan. It doesn't, but being poor means you have to be careful where you put your kindness. Some folks will take it and call you foolish. Ethan felt the sentence reach him. You're worried I'll use what she did. I'm worried everybody will. Grace pulled out the chair across from him and sat at last. A little black girl hands a rich white man $3 at an orphanage. People love that kind of story. They'll cry over it during breakfast, share it on their phones, say the Lord works in mysterious ways, then go on about their day. Meanwhile, my baby has to keep being a child after everyone else is done feeling inspired. Ethan did not answer quickly. He respected her more for saying it plainly. You're right to be protective, he said. I don't need you to tell me I'm right. I need to know what you plan to do. From the kitchen chair, Annie looked between them. Ethan placed the $3 on the table, still folded. First, I plan to keep these, not as a donation to spend, but as a reminder. Annie asked me to receive them, and I did. I won't put them in a press release. I won't auction them. I won't turn them into a slogan without your permission. Grace's eyes flicked to the money. Second, Ethan continued, I toured part of Street Mary's after the event. The building needs work. The children need more than holiday gifts. Tomorrow, I'm bringing people who can assess the roof, heat, food, medical care, counseling, and education needs. No cameras. Grace studied him. And after tomorrow, that depends on what we find. But I canceled my flight. I'm staying. Annie's face brightened. You're coming back. Yes. Grace leaned back slightly, as if she wanted to believe him, but had learned belief should come slowly. Mr. Whitmore, forgive me, but men like you don't usually stay around here long. No, Ethan said, we don't. That wasn't a compliment. I didn't take it as one. For the first time, a small smile touched Grace's mouth. It disappeared quickly, but it was there. Annie slid off her chair and went to a small shelf near the window. She picked up a little box of crayons, the basic kind with most of the paper peeled away, and brought it to the table. These still work, she said, pushing them toward Ethan as if proving she had not sacrificed too much. I don't need the big box right now. Grace closed her eyes. Annie, what? Ethan looked at the broken crayons, then at the $3. He understood then that Annie had not given from a child's abundance. She had chosen between color for herself and warmth for someone else. The simplicity of it nearly undid him again. Annie, he said, can I ask why you watch the children at Street Mary so much? She leaned against her mother's chair. Because sometimes they look like they're waiting. Waiting for what? She shrugged. Somebody. Grace's hand moved to Annie's shoulder. Caleb waits by the gate, Annie said. I asked Mommy why he does that. She said maybe his heart is looking for someone even when his eyes know they're not coming. Grace looked down. I didn't know she remembered that. Children remember the things adults say when we think they're too young to carry them, Ethan said softly. Grace looked at him then with a different kind of attention, as if hearing something personal beneath his words. You sound like you know. Ethan glanced toward the window across the dark yard where Street Mary's lights glowed behind the fence. I grew up with everything except people who came when I called. The room went quiet. Annie frowned. You didn't have a mommy. I did, Ethan said gently. But she and my father were gone a lot. Who rubbed your back when you were scared? Ethan smiled sadly. Mostly no one. Annie considered this with the serious compassion only a child could offer. Then she walked around the table and patted his sleeve twice. That's sad. Yes, he said. It was. Grace watched the gesture, her eyes shining now. Baby, come here, let Mr. Whitmore breathe. It's all right, Ethan said. But Grace still pulled Annie close. Not harshly, just with the instinct of a mother who understood how easily her child's heart could wander into other people's pain. A knock came at the open doorway. Olivia stood outside, arms folded against the cold. I'm sorry to interrupt, Ethan. I confirmed the hotel extension and started the calls for tomorrow. Grace looked toward her. Recognition sharpened her expression. You're the one who laughed. Olivia's face fell. Yes, ma'am, I am. Annie tucked herself closer to Grace. Olivia stepped just inside the doorway, but did not come farther. Miss Carter, I apologized to Annie, but I should apologize to you, too. What I said was careless. Your daughter offered something precious, and I treated it like it was small. I'm sorry. Grace looked at her for a long moment. Did you say sorry because your boss got angry? Olivia took the question without flinching. At first, maybe, but then I saw the rooms inside St. Mary's, and I saw your daughter forgive me faster than I deserved. So now I'm saying it because I mean it. Grace's face softened by a fraction. All right. Annie looked up at her mother. Mommy says sorry means you try not to do it again. Olivia nodded. I remember and I will. Grace opened the door wider. Then come in out of the cold for a minute. I have coffee. It's not fancy. Olivia gave a small, grateful laugh. I think regular coffee is exactly what I deserve tonight. The four of them gathered in the little kitchen while Grace poured coffee into mismatched mugs and warmed a small pan of macaroni and cheese for Annie. Nothing about the moment belonged in a press packet. There was no perfect lighting, no stage, no applause, just a tired mother, a little girl with old crayons, a humbled billionaire and an assistant learning that kindness was not an image to manage but a responsibility to protect. Before Ethan left, Grace walked him to the porch. Annie had fallen asleep on the sofa, one hand under her cheek, her shoes still on. Olivia waited by the walkway, speaking quietly on the phone with someone from Ethan's foundation. Grace looked across at St. Mary's. Those children matter to Annie. I know she's little. She thinks if she gives everything she has, adults will know what to do with it. Ethan touched the pocket where the $3 rested again. This adult is going to try very hard not to disappoint her. Grace nodded slowly. Trying hard is good. Showing up tomorrow is better. I'll be here. The porch light hummed softly above them. Across the fence, the orphanage windows glowed like small squares of hope in the cold. As Ethan walked back toward the waiting car, he understood that Annie's $3 had not bought anything yet. Not socks, not soup, not crayons, but they had purchased the one thing no foundation budget had ever forced from him before, his attention. And now that he had truly seen St. Mary's, truly seen Annie, Caleb, Sister Margaret, and Grace, he knew attention would not be enough unless it became action. By 7 the next morning, the parking lot outside St. Mary's Children's Home looked different. Not festive, not decorated, different in a quieter, more serious way. There were no television vans, no folding tables covered in red paper, no reporter fixing her hair in the reflection of a camera lens. Instead, 3 practical vehicles sat near the curb. A white van from a local construction firm, a dark SUV from Whitmore Group and an aging blue sedan driven by a pediatrician who had once volunteered at a free clinic on the west side of Atlanta. Ethan arrived before anyone expected him. Sister Margaret saw him through the front window and stood still for a moment with one hand on the curtain. She had been awake since 5, as usual, making sure breakfast was started, checking on a child with a cough, and reminding 2 boys that winter boots did not belong under pillows. She had half expected Mr. Whitmore's people to come. Assistants often came, representatives came, junior staff members with clipboards came. Rich men themselves usually did not return the morning after they cried. But there he was, stepping out of the SUV in a dark wool coat, holding a plain paper cup of coffee, his face tired but alert. Olivia got out behind him with a folder under one arm and a phone already buzzing in her hand. She looked less polished than the day before, her hair pulled back simply, her eyes carrying the faint shadow of a short night. Behind them came a structural engineer named Martin Reeves, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and work boots named Carla Monroe, a pediatrician named Dr. Helen Price, a child psychologist named Dr. Samuel Reed, and a nutritionist from Whitmore's Foundation, Denise Parker. No one carried a camera. Sister Margaret opened the front door before Ethan knocked. You came back, she said. Ethan heard the meaning beneath the words, I said I would. People say many things in December. I know. He looked past her into the warm hallway where children's voices rose and fell around breakfast. May we come in? She stepped aside. Wipe your feet. The little ones crawl on that floor. Ethan almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Inside, Street Mary's was waking into its ordinary rhythm. A toddler cried because his oatmeal was too hot. Two girls argued over who had taken the purple hair tie. Someone laughed in the dining room, then coughed hard enough that Dr. Price looked up at once. The building smelled of toast, powdered milk, old radiators, and the chicken soup that had been stretched into another meal. Ethan stood in the hall for a second, taking it in without cameras, without music, without the bright distraction of wrapped gifts. The orphanage felt more real. It was not tragic in the dramatic way people imagine from a distance. It was alive. Children ran, complained, shared, sulked, giggled, and needed things every minute. The need was not one large sad picture. It was 100 small needs arriving before breakfast. Sister Margaret led the group into the dining room. Several children looked up. Caleb sat near the end of a long table, spoon in hand. The red toy truck from yesterday parked beside his bowl like a guard. When he saw Ethan, he stopped eating. "You came back," Caleb said. The room went quieter. Ethan crouched beside his chair. "I did, Annie said you would." That struck him harder than Caleb could know. "Then I'm glad I didn't make her wrong." Caleb considered this, then returned to his oatmeal. Sister Margaret watched the exchange without comment, but Ethan saw something soften around her eyes. The assessment began in the basement. Martin Reeves tapped pipes, checked the boiler, and muttered to himself in the language of old buildings. He removed a glove, touched a section of metal, and shook his head. "This system has passed its service life. It's not just inefficient, it's unreliable. You've been lucky. We pray," Sister Margaret said. "Prayer is good," Martin replied, looking up at a corroded joint. "But I'd still replace the boiler." Carla inspected the roof access, window frames, stair rails, and cracked exterior steps. She did not dramatize anything. She simply made notes, took measurements, and occasionally said things that made Olivia write faster. "This railing is loose enough to fail if a child leans hard. This window is leaking air all winter. That ceiling stain means water is still coming in somewhere. This playground surface isn't safe. A bad fall here could break an arm." Ethan listened without interrupting. Each observation felt like a bill that had come due long before he arrived. He wondered how many times people had stood in these same rooms, nodded with concern, promised to look into it, and then let the building keep aging around the children. In the small medical room, Dr. Price opened cabinets and checked supplies. She found cough syrup, bandages, children's pain reliever, a thermometer with weak batteries, and a stack of health forms held together by a rubber band. "How often does a doctor come?" she asked. "When we can arrange it," Sister Margaret said. "We use urgent care when necessary." Dr. Price's mouth tightened. "Urgent care is not preventive care." "No," Sister Margaret said. "But urgent care takes children when I bring them." The doctor looked at Ethan. "They need regular screenings, vaccination review, dental referrals, vision checks, developmental assessments for the younger ones, and someone needs to track chronic issues, asthma, allergies, trauma-related sleep problems." Dr. Reed, the psychologist, had been quiet until then. He was standing by a bulletin board covered with children's drawings. One showed a house with no door. Another showed a large person holding a small person's hand under heavy black rain. "There's trauma here," he said softly. "Not just poverty, separation, abandonment, uncertainty. Children can survive a great deal, but they need help naming." "What happened to them?" Sister Margaret folded her hands. "I have asked for counseling support for years." Ethan looked at Olivia. She did not defend the system. She simply wrote it down. By mid-morning, the group moved to the kitchen. Denise Parker reviewed the pantry, freezer, and meal schedule. Mrs. Alvarez was there again, rolling biscuit dough with her sleeves pushed up. "Don't tell me I don't know how to feed children, Mrs. Alvarez warned before anyone asked. Denise smiled gently. "I wouldn't dare. I'm here to figure out how to make sure you have what you need." Mrs. Alvarez looked suspicious for another second, then nodded toward the shelves. "Then start with fresh fruit, milk that doesn't run out, and chicken that isn't only for Sundays." Denise laughed softly and began writing. Ethan stayed near the doorway. He thought of Annie telling him $3 could buy soup if it was on sale. He thought of Grace's macaroni and cheese, of old crayons on a kitchen table, of Caleb asking if he would come back after Christmas. A strange shame moved through him, not the kind that paralyzed, but the kind that pushed a man toward work. Near noon, Annie appeared outside the dining room window. She was on her own side of the fence, bundled in the yellow coat, her school backpack hanging from one shoulder. Grace stood behind her, holding a travel mug of coffee and looking as tired as she had the night before. She had brought Annie over before school, just long enough to see whether Ethan had kept his promise. Caleb spotted her first and waved through the glass. Annie waved back, then looked past him until she saw Ethan. Ethan stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting. Grace gave him a cautious nod. "Morning, Mr. Whitmore." "Good morning, Miss Carter." Annie looked toward the vehicles in the lot. "Are those the fixing people?" "Yes," Ethan said, "some of them." "Is the window getting fixed?" We're making a list. Annie's face fell slightly. A list doesn't keep Caleb warm. Grace put a hand on her shoulder. Annie, but Ethan knelt, meeting Annie's eyes. You're right, a list doesn't keep anyone warm. But it helps us know where to start so we don't just fix the easy things and leave the hard ones. Annie thought about that. Are you starting today? Yes, today. She looked satisfied. Then her gaze moved to his coat. Do you still have it? Ethan knew what she meant. He reached inside and touched the pocket where the $3 were folded inside a small envelope Olivia had found for him the night before. Yes, right here. You didn't spend it. No, I told you. I'm keeping it safe. Grace watched him closely as if that answer mattered more than he realized. Annie nodded. Good, because that means you remember. Ethan's throat tightened. It does. Grace checked the time and sighed. Come on, baby, school. Annie waved once more at Caleb through the window, then hurried down the sidewalk beside her mother. Ethan watched them go, the little girl with the backpack, the mother already bracing for another long workday. Both of them living close enough to Street Mary's to hear its loneliness through the walls of their own life. When Ethan returned inside, Olivia was waiting in the hallway. We've got preliminary numbers, she said. They're not small. He looked through the dining room doorway. Caleb was eating soup beside two younger children. One girl had taken her bread and carefully wrapped half in a napkin for later until Mrs. Alvarez gently told her there would be more. No, Ethan said, I didn't expect them to be. Olivia lowered her voice. Ethan, repairing this building properly is one thing. Long-term care is another. Food, medical support, counseling, education, staff, scholarship someday. This isn't a donation. It's an ongoing commitment. He looked at her. Good. She paused. Good. If it can be solved with one check, we should have solved it years ago. For the first time that day, Olivia smiled for real. By late afternoon, the team gathered in the parlor with clipboards, photographs, repair notes, and cost estimates. Sister Margaret sat in a straight-back chair near the piano, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. She listened as each professional summarized their findings. Roof replacement, heating system overhaul, window sealing, playground resurfacing, medical partnerships, nutrition plan, counseling program, staffing review, educational support. The list grew longer and longer. No one tried to make it sound easy. When they finished, silence filled the room. Sister Margaret looked at Ethan. This is usually where people tell me they will do what they can. Ethan stood by the window watching children move through the yard under the dimming sky. Caleb was outside now with his red truck, pushing it along the porch rail. For a moment, Ethan imagined Annie on the other side of the fence, watching as she had watched so many times before. He took the envelope from his coat pocket and held it in his hand. I won't do what I can, he said. Sister Margaret frowned slightly. I'll do what is required. Olivia looked up from her notes. Ethan turned to the room. Start with heat, roof, windows, and food. Those are immediate. I want contractors scheduled, not just contacted. Dr. Price, build the medical plan. Dr. Reed, I want counseling options by age group. Denise, set up a nutrition budget that assumes growing children should eat like growing children, not like leftovers or a strategy. Olivia, I want a foundation account separated for Street Mary's by tomorrow. Sister Margaret's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion now, but in the effort to keep her emotions contained. Mr. Whitmore, that will cost a great deal. Ethan looked down at the small envelope in his hand. Yesterday, a child with $3 gave more than I have given in years. I can afford to answer properly. No one spoke for a moment. Outside, the old Christmas lights flickered on again along the roof line. One strand still blinked unevenly, but now Ethan did not see failure in it. He saw a signal, something tired, but not finished, something waiting for someone to stop admiring it from a distance and finally climb a ladder. That evening, when he left Street Mary's, Ethan did not feel the satisfaction he usually felt after making a donation. There was no applause, no headline, no clean ending. There was only a long list in Olivia's folder, 3 wrinkled dollars in his pocket and a promise that had grown larger with every room he had entered. For the first time in his life, that felt less like a burden than a beginning. By the time Ethan returned to his hotel that night, the city had settled into the kind of winter darkness that made glass towers look colder than they really were. From the top floor suite, Atlanta glittered beneath him in ribbons of headlights, office windows, and street lamps. In another life, on another evening, he might have stood there with a drink in his hand and felt the familiar satisfaction of distance. From high above, hardship became pattern, neighborhoods became lights, people became movement, problems became lines on a report. But that night, distance felt like a lie. He removed his overcoat slowly and placed it over the back of a chair. Before doing anything else, he reached into the inside pocket and took out the small envelope Olivia had given him. Inside were Annie's 3 wrinkled dollars. He did not unfold them, he simply held the envelope in his hand and sat at the large desk by the window, staring at it as if it might speak. Again, the room around him was too perfect. White sheets turned down on a king-sized bed. A silver tray with untouched fruit. A bottle of sparkling water sweating in an ice bucket. Thick carpet. Silent heat. A bathroom with marble counters and towels folded so neatly they looked unused by human hands. Ethan thought of the plastic over the window in Caleb's dormitory. The brown water stain near the ceiling. The shelves in the storage room labeled not with abundance but with hope. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. For years, he had believed generosity could be measured in numbers: $1 million for a literacy program, $5 million for medical research, $10 million to a scholarship fund with his name on a bronze plaque. The numbers were clean. They fit on screens, in speeches, in annual reports. They impressed people who already had enough to eat. But Annie's $3 refused to behave like a number. They had a face, a voice, a yellow coat, a mother who worked until her hands dried out from soap and chemicals, a little boy across a fence who cried quietly enough that only another child bothered to hear him. Ethan opened his eyes and pulled the hotel notepad toward him. At the top of the page, he wrote 3 words. What is required? Not what looked good, not what played well in the press, not what would make donors comfortable. What was required? His phone buzzed. The screen showed Olivia's name. He answered, "Tell me." "I've got preliminary calls back," Olivia said. She sounded exhausted but focused. "Martin can get a crew out to inspect the roof in more detail tomorrow afternoon. He says emergency weather sealing can start within 48 hours if we approve it tonight. Boiler replacement is more complicated, but he knows a company that can provide temporary heating units while bids come in. Approve it that fast tonight." He heard her typing. "All right. Dr. Price can arrange a mobile pediatric clinic next week. Dental is harder, but she has a contact at a university program. Dr. Reed is working on trauma counseling options. Denise is building a nutrition plan, but she says the kitchen equipment needs upgrading. If we want fresh meals consistently, then upgrade it." A pause. "Ethan, I know you mean that, but we need structure. If we throw money without a system, it becomes another beautiful mess." He looked at the notepad. "What is required?" "You're right," he said. That seemed to surprise her. "I am. Yes, we need a system, a real one, not a holiday campaign." Olivia exhaled. "Then we should talk about the foundation." Ethan stood and walked to the window. Far below, cars moved through the city like small sparks. The foundation has existing programs. It does. But Street Mary's needs something dedicated, separate account, separate oversight, transparent reporting, not just a restricted gift that disappears into administrative language. Build it. Ethan, what? We can build it, but you need to decide what this is. A repair project, a 1-year commitment, a public campaign, a private initiative. He looked back at the envelope on the desk. "I don't know yet." "That's honest. It's not enough." "No," Olivia said softly. "But it's a start." After the call ended, Ethan remained at the window. The silence of the hotel room pressed in around him. It reminded him unwillingly of childhood. His parents' house had never been quiet because it was peaceful. It was quiet because everyone important was elsewhere. His father traveled for mergers, acquisitions, conferences, negotiations. His mother served on boards, hosted charity luncheons, and smiled in photographs beside children whose names she never remembered after dessert. Ethan had been loved, perhaps in the distant way wealthy families sometimes. Loved, through tuition paid on time, vacations planned by assistants, bedrooms filled with expensive things. But when he was 8 and had a fever, it was Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, who sat beside him with a cool cloth. When he woke from nightmares, it was the hallway light, not a parent, that kept him company. On Christmas mornings, there were always gifts, too many gifts. But sometimes his father opened calls in another room, while Ethan opened boxes alone. He had spent most of his adult life proving he did not need anyone to come when he called. Annie had exposed the old wound with one simple sentence. "I have a mommy, they don't." Ethan pressed his hand against the cold window glass. "I knew what loneliness felt like," he thought. "So why did I let myself become the kind of man who could walk past it with a prepared speech?" He did not like the answer. The answer was easier than cruelty and more dangerous because of it. He had been busy. He had trusted reports. He had let other people turn suffering into bullet points. He had allowed charity to become another department of his life instead of a demand on his conscience. At 9:30, Olivia arrived at the suite with coffee, a stack of folders, and the expression of a woman who had decided sleep could wait. Ethan led her in and they spread papers across the dining table. Preliminary estimates, contact lists, foundation structures, emergency repairs, staffing possibilities, medical partnerships, insurance concerns, legal requirements, consent forms for children, privacy protections, media boundaries. About the media, Olivia said carefully. "No video of Annie without Grace's permission." "I know, I agree." Olivia tapped a folder, "but the clip from yesterday is already online. The local station aired it before we could stop them. Not the whole exchange, but enough. People are sharing it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Are they using her name?" "Not yet. But they will if someone gives it to them. No one from our side does. I've already told the team. Olivia hesitated. People are calling her the $3 girl. Ethan disliked it immediately. She has a name. Yes, Olivia said, and a mother and a life. He looked at her, hearing the change in her voice. You understand now. I'm starting to. She sat back and rubbed her forehead. I keep thinking about what Grace said. How people will cry over a story and then keep moving. I've helped build those stories, Ethan. I've packaged them. I've made sure they were touching but not too uncomfortable. So have I. Yes, she said, but you get praised for it. I get paid for it. The honesty hung between them. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we do this differently. How? Annie is not the campaign. The children are not props. Street Mary's doesn't become a backdrop for my redemption. He picked up the envelope with the $3. This stays with me quietly until Grace decides otherwise. Olivia nodded. And if she never does? Then she never does. For the next 2 hours, they worked not on speeches, but on commitments. Ethan authorized immediate emergency repairs. Olivia scheduled the assessment teams into a shared calendar. They drafted a private memo to Whitmore Foundation Leadership Street. Mary's Children's Home would receive urgent infrastructure support pending a broader long-term plan. No press release, no donor language, no photographs. Near midnight, Ethan's phone rang again. This time it was Daniel Pierce, Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Group and a man who believed emotion was something best handled after quarterly projections. I hear you canceled Callahan's dinner. Daniel said without greeting. I did. He's irritated. He'll recover. He represents a lot of capital, Ethan. So do I. A silence followed. Daniel lowered his voice. Olivia said you're authorizing emergency work at an orphanage. That's right. How much are we talking? We'll know more tomorrow. That is not an answer my department can process. Then tell your department to prepare for an unusual week. Daniel sighed. Is this about that video? The little girl. Ethan looked at the envelope. Be careful how you finish that sentence. I'm not criticizing. I'm asking whether this is a decision or a reaction. Ethan was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question. Even if Daniel asked it with the warmth of a tax audit, it started as a reaction. Ethan said, now it's a decision. And the scope, whatever is required. That phrase makes accountants nervous. Good. Maybe it should make all of us nervous that it took $3 from a child to get our attention. Daniel did not answer at once. When he did, his tone had changed slightly. Send me the preliminary list. I'll move funds into a temporary restricted account by morning. Thank you, Ethan. Yes. Don't make a promise to children unless you're prepared to be haunted by it. Ethan almost smiled. I already am. After midnight, the suite finally went quiet again. Olivia left with the folders. The city kept glowing. Ethan should have slept, but he could not bring himself to turn out the lights. Instead, he took Annie's $3 from the envelope and placed them on the desk. He smoothed them carefully, not to erase the wrinkles, but to see them fully. 3 tired bills, 3 small witnesses. He found a clean envelope from the hotel stationery drawer and wrote on the front in black ink. Annie Carter Street Mary's December. Then beneath it, he wrote, do not forget. He placed the envelope beside his phone so it would be the first thing he saw in the morning. Before dawn, he finally lay down, still dressed in his shirt and trousers. The city beyond the curtains turning slowly from black to gray. He did not feel noble. He did not feel generous. He felt ashamed, awake, and strangely grateful because somewhere across town, behind a fence beside an old orphanage, a little girl had believed that $3 could matter if she placed them into the right hands. Now Ethan had to become the kind of man who proved her right. Morning came gray and cold with a low sky that made Atlanta feel smaller than usual. Ethan was already awake when the first light reached the hotel windows. He had slept badly, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because comfort itself had become uncomfortable. The envelope on the desk was the first thing he saw when he sat up. Annie Carter Street Mary's December. Do not forget. The $3 lay inside, folded with a care he usually reserved for contracts worth millions. He picked up the envelope, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and for the first time in years left a luxury hotel without thinking about the meeting waiting for him, the market opening, or the day's headlines. He thought only of the old brick building by the fence and of a child who had trusted him with everything she had. By 8:30, Olivia was in the lobby with 2 coffees and a list that had grown overnight. Before we go back to Street Mary's, she said, handing him a cup. Daniel moved the emergency funds. Martin has crews on standby. Dr. Price confirmed the mobile clinic. Denise is already calling food suppliers, and I got 3 messages from reporters asking whether you plan to make a statement about the $3 girl. Ethan's jaw tightened at the phrase. No statement. I told them we're focused on the children's privacy. Good. Olivia studied him. There is one more thing. Grace called Sister Margaret this morning. She said Annie barely slept. She kept asking whether you were really coming back. Ethan looked toward the glass doors of the hotel where cars were sliding through the morning traffic. Then we go there first. They reached the Carter house just after 9. The small porch looked different in daylight. The paint was more worn, the railing more weathered, the flower pot beside the steps even more fragile. But there was also a string of paper snowflakes taped inside the front window, clearly cut by Annie's hand, uneven and proud. Ethan paused before knocking. He had faced hostile boards, skeptical investors, and rooms full of lawyers, but he found himself nervous outside that little house. Money could buy entrance into almost any place. It could not buy the right to enter a mother's trust. Grace opened the door with a dish towel in one hand and fatigue in her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Miss Bennett." "Good morning, Miss Carter." Ethan said, "I hope we're not too early." Grace gave a short laugh. "I work 2 jobs and raise a child. Early is a luxury I don't have." Olivia smiled gently. "That sounds like something my grandmother would have said." Grace stepped aside. "Come in." Annie's been watching the clock since breakfast. Annie was at the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal in front of her, though it looked barely touched. Her school backpack sat on the floor beside her chair. When she saw Ethan, she straightened. "You came back." "I said I would," Ethan said. Annie looked at his coat. "Do you still have it?" Ethan tapped the inside pocket. "Right here." "The $3. The $3. Annie nodded as solemn as a judge approving a sworn statement. Then she picked up her spoon and finally took a bite of oatmeal. Grace watched this, something soft and pained moving across her face. "She asked me 3 times before bed if billionaires can forget things." Ethan sat when Grace gestured toward a chair. "They can," he said too easily. "That's why I wrote it down." Annie's eyes widened. "You wrote down my $3. I wrote down your name. Street Marys and do not forget." Annie seemed satisfied with that. "Good." Grace poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "She believes paper makes things official." "She's not wrong," Olivia said, accepting the mug with both hands. "A lot of grown-up promises should be written down more often." Grace leaned against the counter. "So, what happens now? Yesterday, you said you were bringing people to fix things. Last night, you talked about assessments. That all sounds good, but I'm going to ask plain because I don't have time for fancy. Are you helping them for real, or are we all going to wake up next week and find out this was a Christmas story people moved on from?" Ethan appreciated the directness. It gave him something solid to answer. "For real," he said. "Emergency repairs start this week. Heat, roof, windows, safety issues first. Food support begins immediately. Medical screenings are being scheduled. Counseling support, too. But I also want to build something longer term, and I want to do it without turning Annie into a public symbol she never asked to be." Grace crossed her arms. "I'm listening. I will not use her face or full name publicly without your permission. I will not put her in front of reporters. I won't ask her to repeat what she said for cameras. And if you decide you want her left completely out of it, we will honor that." Grace's expression did not soften fully, but some of the guarded tension left her shoulders. "Thank you for saying that. I should have said it last night." "Yes," Grace said, and then after a beat. "But saying it now still counts." Annie looked from her mother to Ethan. "Am I in trouble for giving him the money?" Grace's face changed instantly. She crossed the kitchen and crouched beside Annie's chair. "No, baby, you are not in trouble. But you looked worried." "I was worried because the world doesn't always know how to be gentle with kind people." Grace brushed a crumb of oatmeal from Annie's sleeve. "Especially little girls." Annie thought about that. "Mr. Ethan was gentle." Ethan looked down at his coffee, humbled by how much that simple sentence meant to him. Grace stood. "He was. And we're going to make sure everybody else is too." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "Miss Carter, about yesterday. I apologized to Annie, but I want to say again with you here. I'm sorry. I laughed because I was thinking like a media person. I saw a moment getting messy. I didn't see a child giving her whole heart. That was wrong." Grace studied her. "You ever been poor, Miss Bennett?" Olivia hesitated. "Not like this, but my mother was. She raised me in a small town outside Macon. We had enough because she made sure I thought we had enough. I didn't understand until I was grown how much she skipped." Grace nodded slowly. "Then you know $3 can be a lot of money." "I do now," Olivia said. Annie lifted her spoon. $3 can buy soup if it's on sale." "It can," Olivia said, smiling sadly. "And sometimes it can buy a grown woman a lesson she badly needed." Annie smiled at that, unsure but pleased. Grace checked the clock on the wall. "We need to get Annie to school. I can drive you," Ethan offered. Grace gave him a look. He caught himself. Not. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to assume." That earned the smallest real smile from her. "We'll take the bus like normal." "Normal matters." "Yes," Ethan said. "It does." Annie slid from her chair and went to get her coat. While she struggled with the top button, Ethan asked Grace if she could spare 5 more minutes on the porch. Grace nodded and told Annie to brush her teeth. Outside, the air was sharp. Across the fence, Street Marys was busy with morning movement. A contractor was already measuring the porch rail. A Whitmore Foundation van had pulled in near the side entrance. Children watched from the windows, curious about the unfamiliar adults carrying ladders, clipboards, and tool bags. Grace held her coffee with both hands. That place has been there longer than I've been alive. Some folks in the neighborhood look away from it because it makes them sad. Annie never could. She sees them, Ethan said. She sees everybody. Grace watched a child's face appear in an upstairs window, then vanish. Her father used to say that about her. Ethan turned slightly. Grace had not mentioned Annie's father before. He's gone, he asked carefully. Car accident when Annie was 2. Grace's voice was steady, but the steadiness had clearly been earned. He was a good man. Worked maintenance at a hospital. Could fix anything with a screwdriver and patience. Annie doesn't remember much, but I tell her stories. I don't want her thinking love disappears just because a person does. I'm sorry, Ethan said. Grace nodded. Thank you. For a moment, they stood in silence. 2 people from different worlds looking at the same orphanage. Finally, Grace said, do you know why Annie gave you the money? She said, the children needed it more. Yes, but it's more than that. Grace looked at him. She knows what it means to lose somebody. Maybe not in words, but in her bones. She has me, but she knows one person can be here one day and gone the next. So when she sees Caleb waiting at that gate, I think something in her understands. Ethan felt the envelope against his chest. That makes what she did even more extraordinary. It makes it dangerous, too, Grace said. A heart like hers will try to carry things too heavy for a child. I don't want her carrying this. Then don't let her. The words were not a plea, they were a charge. Ethan met her eyes. I won't. Annie came out then, backpack on, coat buttoned crookedly again. Grace fixed the button with practiced speed. Olivia stood by the walkway, ready to step aside and let their morning continue. Before leaving, Annie walked to the fence and looked through at Street Mary's. Caleb appeared near the dining room window, pressing one hand against the glass. Annie raised her hand. He raised his back. Ethan watched the exchange. No speech he had ever given had carried as much meaning as that small wave through a fence. Grace took Annie's hand. Come on, baby. Bus won't wait because we're having a meaningful morning. Annie giggled and the sound loosened something in the cold air. As they walked down the sidewalk, Annie turned once. Mr. Ethan, yes, you'll help Caleb's window today. We'll start today. Not just write it down. Not just write it down. She nodded and hurried after her mother. Ethan and Olivia watched until they reached the corner. Then Olivia said quietly, Grace is right. Annie shouldn't have to carry this. No, Ethan said, she shouldn't. Across the fence, a contractor lifted a ladder toward the side of Street Mary's. Inside the building, children pressed close to the windows to see what was happening. Ethan thought of Grace's words, don't let her carry this. He had spent most of his life carrying power like a possession. Now for the first time he understood it as a responsibility that should have been obvious all along. He touched the envelope inside his coat. Annie had given him $3, but she had not given him permission to feel noble. She had given him a duty. And duty, if it was real, did not end when the heart was moved. It began when the work became inconvenient. By noon, Street Mary's children's home no longer looked like a place waiting politely for help. It looked like a place where help had finally stopped asking permission to be real. A ladder leaned against the side wall beneath Caleb's dormitory window. Martin Reeves stood below it speaking with 2 workers in heavy jackets while pointing to the frame where cold air had been slipping in all winter. Near the front steps, Carla Monroe knelt beside the loose railing, tightening one bolt and marking another with blue tape. In the kitchen, Denise Parker was talking with Mrs. Alvarez about weekly menus, fresh deliveries, and how many children would actually eat oranges if oranges were available every day instead of appearing like a miracle once a month. Inside, the children watched everything with the careful suspicion of people who had learned not to celebrate too early. Ethan noticed that most of them did not ask when the work would be done. They asked smaller questions. Is the ladder staying? Will the men come back tomorrow? Are they fixing the bathroom, too? Does this mean we get milk every day? Every question had the same hidden center. Is this real or is this just another visit? Ethan answered only what he knew. The ladder is just for today. Yes, they'll be back tomorrow. We're checking the bathroom. We're working on the milk. He had never chosen words so carefully in his life. In boardrooms, exaggeration passed for confidence. With children, exaggeration felt like theft. Caleb followed him from a distance for nearly 10 minutes before finally speaking. Mr. Ethan. Ethan turned. Yes, if they fix the window, will it still make the whistling sound? I hope not. Caleb looked disappointed. You like the whistling? The boy shrugged. Sometimes it sounds like a train. Ethan crouched beside him. Would you miss it? Maybe a little. Caleb rubbed one wheel of his red truck with his thumb. But I don't like when my blanket gets cold. Then we'll get rid of the cold and see if we can find you a better train sound. Caleb considered that arrangement and nodded. Okay. Across the hall, Sister Margaret watched with quiet interest. Ethan saw her and rose. What? Nothing, she said. That didn't look like nothing. It is simply unusual, she replied, to see a man who owns towers negotiating with a child over a whistling window. Ethan glanced back at Caleb, who had returned to pushing his truck along the baseboard. I'm learning the real negotiations are smaller than I thought. They often are, Sister Margaret said. Children rarely ask for the moon. Mostly they ask for warmth, food, truth, and someone who comes back. The words stayed with Ethan as the day continued. By early afternoon, Olivia had turned the parlor into a temporary command center. Not the polished version she would have built 2 days earlier, but a practical one. The old coffee table was covered with legal pads, inspection notes, supplier lists, medical forms, and a map of the building. Her phone rang constantly. She spoke with foundation staff, vendors, Grace, Daniel Pierce, and at least one reporter who did not enjoy being told there would be no statement. No, we are not confirming the child's identity, Olivia said firmly into the phone. No, Mr. Whitmore will not be doing an interview today because the story is not about whether a billionaire felt emotional. It is about children who need privacy and support. Yes, you may quote me on the privacy part. She ended the call and caught Ethan looking at her. What? She asked. You're getting good at that. At not exploiting a child. At remembering what matters. Olivia leaned back, tired. Don't praise me yet. Yesterday I laughed at $3. Yesterday you learned. She looked down at her notes. I keep thinking about what Annie said. They need it more than me. Most adults I know spend their lives explaining why someone else's need is not their responsibility. Ethan sat across from her. I was one of them. You wrote checks. I wrote checks so I wouldn't have to look too closely. Olivia did not argue. That was one of the things Ethan valued about her even more now. She knew when silence was more honest than comfort. A knock came at the parlor doorway. It was Daniel Pierce, wearing a charcoal overcoat, and the careful expression of a man entering a situation where feelings had gotten ahead of spreadsheets. He looked around at the worn piano, the children's drawings, the crowded table, and then at Ethan. I came because the numbers stopped making sense over the phone, Daniel said. Ethan stood. Good. You should see it in person. Daniel's eyes moved to a child's drawing taped above the mantel. A house with 3 stick figures under a yellow sun. I assumed this was a repair project. It started that way, and now I'm not sure we've been asking the right question. Daniel removed his gloves slowly. The right question being, Ethan picked up one of the assessment sheets, not how much it costs to fix the building. How much it costs to stop treating children like seasonal obligations. Daniel's mouth tightened. That sounds expensive. It should. Olivia watched them carefully. She knew Daniel was not heartless. He was cautious by profession and by temperament. He believed in sustainability, oversight, risk, and all the unromantic things that kept good intentions from collapsing. Ethan needed that, even if part of him resented the interruption. Sister Margaret entered with a tray of coffee, though no one had asked her to serve anyone. Mr. Pierce, she said, reading his name from the visitor badge Olivia had made him wear. If you are here to tell Mr. Whitmore to slow down, you may want coffee first. Men give bad news more gently with something warm in their hands. Daniel blinked, then unexpectedly, he smiled. Thank you, sister. She handed him a mug. You're welcome, and if you are here to help, coffee still applies. He accepted it with both hands. I'm here to understand. That is usually where helping begins, she said. For the next hour, Daniel walked through Street Mary's with Ethan. He saw the dormitory window Caleb had mentioned, the pantry shelves, the medical cabinet, the patched beds, the storage room of hopeful sizes. He asked exact questions: current budget, state support, donor history, maintenance backlog, insurance, staffing ratios, annual operating gaps. Sister Margaret answered all of them. No drama, no pleading, just facts sharpened by years of making too little serve too many. At the end of the tour, Daniel stood in the hallway near the children's cubbies. Each hook had a name. Some had coats, some had sweaters. One hook was empty, waiting for a child who would arrive the following week. Daniel looked at it longer than Ethan expected. My mother spent 2 years in a county children's home, Daniel said quietly. Ethan turned to him. Daniel kept his eyes on the empty hook. Before my grandparents took her in, she didn't talk about it much. But she hated temporary things, temporary beds, temporary shoes, temporary people. He cleared his throat. I suppose I forgot that when I saw the numbers. Ethan said nothing, letting the admission stand. Daniel looked back at him. This cannot be a burst of guilt. No, if we build something, it has to last beyond your mood, beyond one news cycle, beyond one board's enthusiasm. I agree. Then we need a dedicated structure, an endowment, not just emergency cash, independent oversight, a child welfare advisory board, annual audits, restricted funds for food, medical care, building maintenance, education, and transition support for children who age out. Ethan felt something settle into place. Write it up. I already started in my head. Of course you did. Daniel gave him a dry look. Someone has to make mercy solvent. For the first time that day, Ethan laughed. The sound carried down the hallway and two children peeked around the corner to see what was funny. Sister Margaret shooed them gently toward the dining room where Mrs. Alvarez had set out peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and cups of milk. Real milk, Denise had insisted, bought from a nearby grocery store until the supplier account was arranged. Ethan followed the children into the dining room. He watched as one little girl stared at the apple slices on her plate and then looked around as if waiting to be told how many she was allowed to take. Mrs. Alvarez noticed. All of them, baby. That plate is yours. The girl smiled slowly, then picked up one slice with both hands. It was such a small thing, so small it would never appear in a press release. Yet Ethan felt it more deeply than any award he had ever received. A child learning that what was given to her would not be taken back. Near the window, Caleb sat with his red truck beside his cup of milk. He looked through the glass toward the house next door, but Annie was at school. Ethan wondered if she was thinking about Street Marys, whether she was drawing with her old crayons, whether she understood that her $3 had already begun to move adults in rooms she had never entered. Late in the afternoon, Grace arrived to pick Annie up from the bus stop and stopped by the fence. Annie ran ahead of her, backpack bouncing. She looked through the bars and saw workers carrying a new temporary heater toward the side entrance. They came back again, Annie said. Ethan was near enough to hear. He walked to the gate. Annie looked up at him, breathless from running. Are they fixing Caleb's window? Yes. The permanent repair takes a little longer, but they sealed it today. He should be warmer tonight. Annie pressed her hands together under her chin, not in a formal prayer, but in pure relief. Good. Grace caught up, slightly out of breath. Annie, don't run from the corner like that. Sorry, Mommy, but she was still smiling. Daniel, who had followed Ethan outside, stood a few feet behind him. Annie noticed him and grew shy. This is Mr. Pierce, Ethan said. He helps make sure promises have enough money behind them. Annie frowned. Is that a job? Daniel looked at Ethan, then back at Annie. Today it is. She seemed to accept that. Grace studied the activity around Street Marys, the workers, the vans, the open doors. Looks like more than a list. It is, Ethan said. And it needs to become more than repairs. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. What does that mean? I don't know all of it yet, he admitted. But I want to build something that lasts. Food, care, counseling, education, not just for Christmas. Annie slipped her hand through the gate bars, not asking for anything, just reaching. Ethan bent and touched her fingers gently. Do you still have my $3? She asked. Yes, Ethan said. I still have them. Daniel looked at him curiously, but said nothing. Annie nodded. Then you'll remember. Ethan looked at Grace, then at Sister Margaret standing in the doorway, then at Caleb watching from the dining room window, his red truck visible on the sill. Yes, he said, I'll remember. That evening, as the first repaired window held back the cold and the temporary heaters hummed in the old halls, Ethan understood that the work ahead would be bigger than he had imagined. It would involve lawyers, accountants, contractors, doctors, teachers, donors, and people who would warn him to be reasonable. But reasonableness had kept Street Marys patched together for years. What Annie had offered was unreasonable in the purest way. A child giving all she had because need had looked her in the face. And now the adults had no excuse to look away. That night, Ethan did not return to the hotel right away. He sat alone in the back of the SUV outside Street Marys while Olivia finished a phone call near the front steps and Daniel Pierce spoke with Martin Reeves beside the construction van. The old orphanage stood in front of him with several windows glowing against the dark. Temporary heaters hummed inside. A repair crew had sealed Caleb's window before sunset. Mrs. Alvarez had made extra soup, and for the first time in a long while, Sister Margaret had allowed herself to say the children might sleep warm through the night. It should have felt like progress. Instead, Ethan felt the beginning of a heavier truth. Progress was easy when it came with ladders, tools, invoices, and people who knew where to start. A broken window could be measured. A faulty boiler could be replaced. A roof could be repaired. But what about the part of a child that learned not to trust warmth because warmth had left before? What about the boy who liked the whistle of the window because it was the closest thing to a train he had ever owned? What about the little girl across the fence who thought $3 might be enough to summon justice if she placed it in the right hand? Ethan reached into his coat and took out Annie's envelope. The 3 bills were still inside, folded carefully. He did not need to see them to feel them. They had become less like money and more like a question he could not put down. What are you going to do now that you know? Olivia opened the car door and slid into the seat beside him, rubbing her hands together against the cold. Daniel is staying in Atlanta another day, she said. That alone should tell you the world is ending. Ethan smiled faintly. He found a reason to care. He always cares. He just prefers to care in spreadsheets. That may be useful. It will be. Olivia leaned her head back against the seat. He's already talking about an endowment structure, restricted funds, independent oversight, advisory boards, annual audits. I think Sister Margaret frightened him into holiness. Sister Margaret frightens everyone into honesty. Olivia laughed softly, then grew quiet. The driver had not started the engine yet. Outside, through the windshield, they could see Grace and Annie's little house beyond the fence. Its porch light glowed the same steady yellow as the night before. Do you ever wonder, Olivia said, how many places like this we've used as backdrops? Ethan looked at her. She kept her eyes forward. Not in a cruel way. I don't think we meant harm, but how many times did we come in with a banner, hand out something nice, take a picture, and leave people with the same problems we found them with? Ethan looked down at the envelope. Too many. I keep thinking about that child in the dining room today, Olivia said. The one with the apple slices. She looked like she needed permission to eat what was already on her plate. Her voice tightened. That should not be normal to any child. No. Olivia turned to him. What are we building, Ethan? He had been asking himself the same question all day. Something that outlives the feeling. That sounds good, but it is not a plan. No, he admitted. It's a confession. The driver started the engine, but Ethan told him to wait. He needed a few more minutes before the city swallowed them again. In the quiet that followed, Ethan's mind drifted back to his own childhood home. The one newspapers had once called a southern estate, and his father had called a proper place for a Whitmore to grow. It had 22 rooms, 2 staircases, a pool house, a rose garden, and a dining room table long enough for a family that rarely sat at it. The staff were kind to him, but kindness from employees had rules around it. Mrs. Holloway could bring him soup when he was sick, but she could not be his mother. Mr. Ames, the driver, could ask how school went, but he could not be his father. Every adult in that house had cared within the boundaries of a paycheck. For a long time, Ethan had believed that was normal. Then, when he grew older, he decided normal did not matter. Winning mattered, building mattered, becoming important enough that no one could leave him waiting at the top of the stairs again mattered. He made money early, multiplied it quickly, and learned to speak the clean language of success. By 40, people called him generous because he gave away pieces of a fortune he could not spend in 10 lifetimes. But Annie had looked at him with $3 in her hand and made the fortune feel strangely small. I thought giving money meant I was different from my father, Ethan said. Olivia did not interrupt. My father believed money solved the inconvenience of people. If someone needed help, he hired someone. If a charity asked, he wrote a check. If I needed him, he sent a gift. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I hated that. Then I became a man who sent gifts. Olivia's voice was gentle. You came back after a child had to shame you into it. She didn't shame me on purpose. No, that's what made it worse. Outside, the front door of Street Mary's opened. Sister Margaret stepped onto the porch and looked out toward the parked SUV as if she knew Ethan was still sitting there wrestling with ghosts. She lifted one hand in a small, almost impatient gesture. The kind that said, either go home or come in, but do not sit there brooding like a man in a novel. Ethan laughed under his breath. What? Olivia asked. I think I've been summoned. They got out of the SUV and walked back across the cold courtyard. Sister Margaret waited at the door with a folded blanket over one arm. You look too troubled for a man whose contractors worked all afternoon, she said. I was thinking, that is often how trouble begins. Come in. Inside, most of the children were getting ready for bed. The halls held the soft disorder of evening, water running, slippers scuffing, a child complaining that someone had taken the good toothpaste, a staff member reminding 2 boys that indoor voices did not become optional after sunset. Ethan followed Sister Margaret to the parlor where the Christmas tree glowed in the corner. She handed him the folded blanket. For the reading chair, Mr. Whitmore, if you are going to stand in my hallway looking haunted, you may as well be useful. Before he could ask what she meant, a small group of younger children shuffled into the parlor in pajamas and socks. Caleb was among them, red truck in one hand, blanket trailing from the other. He stopped when he saw Ethan. Are you reading tonight? Caleb asked. Ethan looked at Sister Margaret. She picked up a worn picture book from the piano bench and placed it in his hand. Apparently, Olivia covered a smile. Ethan sat in the old armchair. It creaked under him. Caleb and 4 other children settled on the rug. One little girl climbed onto the end of the sofa and tucked her knees beneath her nightgown. Ethan opened the book. It was about a bear who lost his way in the woods and found home by following lanterns. His first few sentences came out stiffly like a man reading instructions for furniture assembly. The children noticed. You have to do the bear voice, one boy said. I was not informed there was a bear voice. There's always a bear voice, Caleb said. Ethan looked at Sister Margaret. She raised an eyebrow. So he did the bear voice. It was terrible. The children laughed. Not polite laughter, real laughter, the kind that filled cracks in old rooms. Ethan tried again, worse on purpose this time, and even Sister Margaret's mouth twitched. Olivia stood in the doorway, watching with her arms folded, her face soft in a way Ethan rarely saw during work hours. Halfway through the story, a little girl leaned against Ethan's chair. He paused, unsure whether to move. Sister Margaret gave the slightest shake of her head. Let her be. So he kept reading. The child rested her head against the side of the chair and listened. By the time the bear found his lantern-lit home, the room had gone quiet. Caleb's eyes were heavy. The little girl by the chair had nearly fallen asleep. Ethan closed the book. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Caleb said, "You came back twice." Ethan looked at him. "I did. Are you coming tomorrow?" "Yes." Caleb nodded, then stood and followed the others when Sister Margaret called bedtime. After they left, Ethan remained in the chair with the book in his lap. His throat felt tight again, but this time the ache was different. Not shame alone, something gentler and harder to name. Sister Margaret began turning off lamps. "Children do not need perfect adults, Mr. Whitmore. They need steady ones. I don't know if I know how to be steady." "Then learn." She said it as if it were that simple. Perhaps, Ethan thought, for her it was. You stayed, you fed, you fixed, you listened, you came back. Maybe steadiness was not a personality trait. Maybe it was a series of ordinary decisions made after the emotion faded. He stood and handed her the book. "Thank you for making me read badly. For reminding me this isn't about a building." Sister Margaret's face softened. "Buildings matter, heat matters, food matters. But yes, you are right. What we are really repairing is trust." When Ethan finally left Street Mary's, the night had deepened. Olivia walked beside him toward the SUV. "You know," she said, "that bare voice may cost you your reputation." "Good. Maybe my reputation was in the way." She laughed, then looked back at the orphanage. "What do we call this?" "The program, I mean, Daniel will ask tomorrow." Ethan paused by the gate. Across the fence, Annie's house was dark now, except for one small bedroom window. He imagined her asleep under a blanket, unaware that the adults were still trying to understand the size of what she had begun. "The Annie promise," he said. Olivia looked at him. "That is beautiful, but Grace will need to approve it." "I know, and it cannot be about making Annie famous." "It won't be. What will it be about?" Ethan touched the envelope in his coat pocket. "A promise that no child at Street Mary's is remembered only when it is convenient." Olivia nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow we ask Grace." Ethan looked once more at the old building, at the windows holding warm light against the cold, at the repaired frame where Caleb might sleep without his blanket turning icy. For the first time since Annie placed $3 in his hand, the question inside him shifted. It was no longer only, "What are you going to do now that you know?" It had become something clearer, heavier, and more lasting. How do you build a promise strong enough for children to lean on? He did not yet know the full answer. But as the SUV pulled away from Street Mary's and the envelope rested over his heart, Ethan understood that the rest of his life might be judged by whether he kept trying to find it. The next morning, Ethan did not begin with contractors, budgets, or legal structures. He began at Grace Carter's kitchen table, because Olivia had been right about one thing. Before a promise could carry Annie's name, it had to pass through the hands of the mother who had protected the name when the rest of the world was just beginning to notice it. Grace listened without interrupting while Ethan explained the idea. Annie sat beside her with a piece of toast, swinging her feet beneath the chair. Not fully understanding why the grown-ups sounded so careful, Olivia stood near the counter with her notebook closed. That alone told Grace something. The assistant was not there to manage a moment. She was there to witness one. "The Annie promise," Grace repeated when Ethan finished. "Yes," Ethan said, "but only if you agree. And only if we do it in a way that protects her. I don't want Annie on billboards. I don't want cameras following her. I don't want her turned into some little symbol people use to feel better about themselves." Grace's fingers rested around her coffee mug. "Then why use her name at all?" Ethan looked at Annie, then back to Grace. "Because what she did should not disappear. But I understand the danger. If you say no, the program will have another name and the work will still happen." Annie looked up. "What's a program?" Grace brushed a crumb from the corner of her daughter's mouth. "It means Mr. Ethan wants to make a promise to help Street Mary's for a long time." "Oh." Annie turned to Ethan. "For Caleb's window." "For Caleb's window," Ethan said. "And for food, doctors, books, birthdays, warm beds, and people who can help when kids feel sad in ways they don't know how to say." Annie's eyes widened a little at the word birthdays. "They don't have birthdays." "They have birthdays," Grace said gently. "But sometimes there isn't enough money to celebrate each one the way children deserve." Annie grew quiet, processing this injustice with the seriousness only children can bring to something adults have learned to excuse. Grace looked at Ethan again. "I don't want my child becoming famous for being poor." "She won't," Ethan said. "I don't want people stopping us at the grocery store asking her to tell the story again because it made them cry online. They won't get that from us. And I don't want her thinking she has to keep saving everybody." Grace's voice tightened. "She is a child. She already watches too much. She already feels too much. I need her to grow up kind, not burdened." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then the promise cannot be hers to carry. It has to be ours." Grace studied him for a long moment. Olivia finally spoke carefully. Miss Carter, we can set rules in writing. No use of Annie's full image without your permission. No interviews unless you request them. No public appearances required. If her first name is used, it is tied to a principle, not a performance. The oversight board can include you or someone you trust. Grace looked at Olivia. You've thought about this. I should have thought about it before I laughed, Olivia said. I'm trying to think better now. Annie leaned toward her mother and whispered, though not quietly enough, I think Miss Olivia is nicer today. Grace's mouth twitched. People can learn, baby. Ethan smiled despite himself. Grace looked down at Annie. How do you feel about Mr. Ethan naming his promise after you? Annie took a long time to answer. Do I have to talk on TV? No, Ethan said immediately. Do I have to wear fancy shoes? Grace laughed softly. No. Do I still get to play with Caleb? Yes, Grace said. Annie shrugged. Then it's okay, but it should be for all the kids. Not me. Ethan felt the simplicity of that answer settle the room. Grace looked at him. You heard her. I did. If you use her name, it better always point back to them. It will. Grace reached across the table and touched Annie's hand. Then you have my permission to call it the Annie Promise. But understand me, Mr. Whitmore, if this starts turning into a show, I will shut our part of it down. I would expect nothing less. Grace leaned back. Good. Then go help those children. By late afternoon, the first formal planning meeting took place in the parlor at St. Mary's. It was not elegant. The old piano was pushed against the wall. The coffee table had been replaced with 2 folding tables from the dining room. Sister Margaret sat at one end, though Ethan had insisted she should be at the center. Grace came after her shift at the laundromat, still wearing her work shoes. Daniel Pierce arrived with folders and a laptop. Olivia brought printed privacy guidelines. Dr. Price, Dr. Reed, Denise Parker, Martin Reeves, and Carla Monroe filled the rest of the room. Mrs. Alvarez came in late, wiping her hands on her apron, and announced that if people were going to discuss feeding children, someone who actually fed them ought to be present. No one argued. Ethan opened the meeting with no speech. I'm here to listen first. Daniel glanced at him, perhaps surprised, then wisely said nothing. Sister Margaret began with the building. She spoke of heat, water, roof, windows, safety, and overcrowding. Martin and Carla added practical timelines. Emergency sealing had begun. Full roof repair would require permits. Boiler replacement could be done in phases. The playground needed resurfacing before spring. Denise spoke next about food. She did not shame anyone. She praised Mrs. Alvarez, and the volunteers then explained what growing children needed. Fresh produce, protein, milk, regular snacks, and meals that did not depend on what happened to be donated that week. Children who have known scarcity often eat in fear, Denise said. Consistency matters as much as calories. Mrs. Alvarez nodded firmly. A child shouldn't have to wonder if seconds are rude. Dr. Price discussed medical care, vaccines, vision, dental, asthma, nutrition deficiencies, regular checkups instead of crisis visits. Dr. Reed followed with trauma care, and the room became quieter. Some of these children have been abandoned, he said. Some removed from unsafe homes. Some lost parents to illness, addiction, violence, incarceration, or circumstances they cannot understand. If we only repair the walls and not the grief inside them, we will have built a warmer building for lonely children. Grace looked toward the hallway where children's voices drifted faintly. Ethan wrote that sentence down. Then, Sister Margaret invited 2 former residents of St. Mary's to speak. One was a young woman named Kesha Moore, now a nurse. The other was a man named Anthony Bell, who worked as a mechanic and still came by every few months to repair bicycles for the children. Kesha stood near the fireplace, twisting a ring on her finger. People always came at Christmas, she said. Don't get me wrong, we loved it. We loved the gifts. We loved the cookies. We loved when someone remembered us for a day. She paused, but January was the hardest. January was when the tree came down. The visitors stopped coming and we were still here. Anthony nodded. Birthdays were worse for me. You could ignore Christmas because everybody was sharing it. But a birthday is yours. When nobody comes for that, you feel like maybe you don't belong to the world at all. No one spoke for several seconds. Grace wiped the corner of her eye with her thumb. Sister Margaret looked down at her folded hands. Ethan felt Annie's $3 in his pocket like a small, steady flame. Daniel cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice was gentler than usual. Then the fund needs categories beyond infrastructure. Food security, medical care, mental health, education, birthday and milestone support, family connection when appropriate, and transition planning for older children. Transition planning, Grace asked. When children age out, Daniel said, housing support, job training, tuition, apprenticeships. If we stop at 18, we are just delaying abandonment. Anthony pointed at him. That, exactly that. Ethan looked around the room. This was no longer a donation. It was a structure taking shape out of testimony, memory, pain, and duty. Olivia wrote the title at the top of a clean page, The Annie Promise. Under it, she added, a long-term commitment to children who deserve more than seasonal kindness. Sister Margaret read it, then looked at Ethan. Pretty words. I know. Pretty words become dangerous when people admire them instead of obeying them. Ethan nodded. Then we build rules that force obedience. Daniel almost smiled. That I can do. As the meeting ended, children began passing the parlor door on their way to supper. Caleb slowed when he saw Grace and Annie arriving at the front entrance. Annie had come with her mother after school, carrying her backpack and wearing the same yellow coat. Caleb lifted his hand and Annie waved so hard her sleeve slipped back from her wrist. Ethan watched them through the doorway. Annie ran to Caleb and he showed her a small piece of blue tape stuck to his sleeve. What's that? She asked. Mr. Martin put it on the window to show where it was fixed, Caleb said proudly as if he had personally supervised the job. Was it cold last night? Not as much. Annie smiled like someone had handed her the moon. Ethan felt everyone in the parlor watching them. Not because they were putting on a show. Because the reason for all the documents, budgets, repairs, and committees was standing right there in the hallway. Two children comparing the miracle of a less cold window. Grace came to Ethan's side. Remember what she said for all the kids, not her. I will. No, Grace said. Don't just remember. Build it so somebody after you has to remember too. That sentence became the final note of the day. That evening, as Ethan left St. Mary's with Daniel and Olivia, the name The Annie Promise was no longer merely an idea. It had permission. It had witnesses. It had warnings. It had a mother's conditions, a nun's skepticism, a former resident's pain, a boy's repaired window, and a little girl's insistence that the promise belonged to everyone. Ethan understood then that naming something after Annie did not make her responsible for it. It made the adults accountable to the truth she had been brave enough to place in his hand. The morning after the planning meeting, St. Mary's Children's Home felt as if it had awakened inside a promise that was still too new to trust. The children noticed the changes first because children always notice what adults think they can hide. They saw Martin Reeves return with 2 more workers and a stack of lumber strapped to the top of his truck. They saw boxes of fresh oranges, milk, eggs, chicken, and whole grain bread carried into the kitchen while Mrs. Alvarez stood with both hands on her hips, directing traffic like a general. They saw Dr. Price tape a colorful sign to the small medical room door that said, "Check-up day next week." They saw Olivia at the parlor table speaking in low serious tones with Daniel Pierce while Sister Margaret read every document before allowing anyone to call it final. But what the children noticed most was that the adults came back. That mattered more than the tools, more than the food, more than the new temporary heaters humming at the ends of the hallway. Adults came and went in the lives of children at St. Mary's. Some came with smiles, some came with papers, some came with court orders, some came with gifts at Christmas, and promises they may even have meant at the time. But promises had a way of fading once adults stepped outside the gate. This time, the adults returned before the children had finished breakfast. Caleb watched from the dining room window as Ethan Whitmore crossed the courtyard with his coat collar turned up against the wind. He carried no gift box, no oversized check, no microphone, just a folder in one hand, and though Caleb did not know it, Annie's $3 folded inside an envelope near his heart. "He's here again," Caleb said. A little girl beside him looked out. "Maybe he lives here now." Caleb considered that. "Rich don't live in old places." Mrs. Alvarez, setting a bowl of oatmeal on the table, said, "Rich people live where the Lord tells them to if they've got sense enough to listen." Caleb did not understand that, but he liked the sound of it. In the parlor, Ethan placed his folder on the table and looked at the words Olivia had printed across the top of the first page. The Annie Promise. Beneath it was the sentence they had shaped late into the night. A long-term commitment to children who deserve more than seasonal kindness. It sounded right, but Sister Margaret had warned him that pretty words were dangerous. So beneath the sentence, Daniel had added numbers, categories, controls, timelines, and responsibilities. Mercy, as he had put it, needed to be solvent. Grace arrived after dropping Annie at school. She was still wearing her laundromat shirt under her coat, and her hands looked chapped from winter and work. Ethan stood when she entered. "Miss Carter," he said. Grace looked at the table covered with papers. "This looks official." "It needs to be. Official things can still fail." Daniel looked up from his laptop. "That is why official things need enforcement." Grace studied him. "You're the money man." "I am. And you think this can work?" Daniel paused. He was not a man who offered comfort cheaply. "I think it can work if it is built to survive enthusiasm." Grace nodded slowly. "That's the first smart thing I've heard from a moneyman in a while." Olivia coughed into her hand to hide a smile. Sister Margaret entered carrying a small stack of folders tied with an old rubber band. "These are past maintenance requests, food budget records, medical referrals we could not afford quickly, and letters I sent to donors who replied with sympathy but not much else." She set them on the table. Ethan looked at the folders. They were worn at the edges, marked by years of waiting. How far back do they go? He asked. Far enough to embarrass people who prefer not to be embarrassed. Good, Grace said. Sister Margaret gave her a dry look. Embarrassment is useful only if it becomes repair. The meeting began not with Ethan, but with the people closest to the children. Sister Margaret spoke first about immediate needs: heat, roof, windows, plumbing, staffing, safety. Denise Parker spoke about a food program that would not depend on holiday donations or random surplus. Dr. Price called in by speakerphone to explain the medical schedule. Every child would receive a basic health screening, dental referrals, vision checks, and follow-up care. Dr. Reed proposed weekly counseling hours, trauma-informed training for staff, and quiet rooms where children could go when their feelings became too large for a crowded dormitory. Grace listened with her arms folded, saying little until Olivia mentioned the public announcement. What announcement? Grace asked. Olivia turned a page carefully. We need to announce the creation of the fund eventually, not as a publicity stunt, but because transparency matters. If Whitmore Group commits $25 million to Street Marys and related child welfare support, the public record should be clear. It also helps protect the money from being quietly redirected later. Grace's eyes moved to Ethan. $25 million. Yes, Ethan said. The room fell silent for a moment. Even Sister Margaret's stern expression faltered. Grace sat back slowly. That is a number I don't know how to look at. It will be placed into a restricted charitable trust, Daniel said, not handed over all at once. It will support infrastructure, operations, health care, counseling, education, birthdays, and milestones, and eventually scholarship or transition support for children who age out. Grace looked at him. Birthdays. Yes, Daniel said, as though discussing birthday cake in a financial structure was perfectly normal. A designated annual allocation, modest but guaranteed. Grace looked away toward the window, and Ethan saw her blink hard. Sister Margaret placed one hand over the folder nearest her. I have buried children's birthday wishes and practical needs for years. Shoes first, medicine first, heat first. A cake felt like a luxury. It isn't, Grace said quietly. Not to a child. No, Sister Margaret said, it is not. Ethan wrote that down, though he knew he would not forget it. The hardest part of the meeting came when they discussed Annie's name. Olivia laid out the guidelines. No full name in national media without Grace's written consent. No interviews with Annie unless Grace requested them. No images of Annie used in promotional materials. No filming at the orphanage without approval from Sister Margaret and the children's guardians or legal representatives. The program could be called the Annie Promise, but the story behind it would be told with restraint. A child gave what she had and reminded adults to do what they should have done already. Grace read every line slowly. When she finished, she tapped the paper once. Add this. Olivia lifted her pen. No one says Annie saved those children. I don't want that on her shoulders. Ethan nodded. Agreed. Grace continued. Say she reminded adults. Say she inspired a promise. But don't you dare make my baby responsible for fixing what grown people ignored. Olivia wrote it down word for word. Daniel looked at Ethan. That language should be in the charter. It will be, Ethan said. Sister Margaret's face softened. Good. Children should be honored without being burdened. By late afternoon, the first version of the Annie Promise had taken shape. It would begin with Street Marys, but it would be built as a model that could later support other small children's homes and community care programs across Georgia. The board would include child welfare professionals, a financial officer, a medical advisor, a former resident, a community representative, Sister Margaret for as long as she wished, and one rotating parent or guardian representative from the neighborhood. Grace refused to join the board at first, saying she had neither the time nor the education for such things. Sister Margaret corrected her immediately. You have the education of noticing, she said. It is rarer than degrees. Grace looked uncomfortable, but she did not say no again. When school let out, Annie came running up the sidewalk in her yellow coat, then remembered her mother's warning and slowed dramatically before reaching the gate. Caleb was already waiting on the inside, his red truck tucked under one arm. Did they fix more things? Annie asked breathlessly. Caleb nodded. Mrs. Alvarez said we're getting oranges twice in 1 week. Annie's eyes widened. Twice, maybe more, he said, lowering his voice as if discussing treasure. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and watched them through the open gate. Grace stood beside him, tired but quiet. Does she know? He asked about the money. No, not really. She knows you're making a promise. That may be enough for now. Grace nodded. Let her be little as long as she can. Annie looked up and saw Ethan. Mr. Ethan, did you write down the promise? Yes, he said. On paper. On a lot of paper. She seemed impressed. Good. Paper helps grown-ups remember. Daniel, standing behind Ethan with a folder in hand, murmured, she is not wrong. Annie ran to her mother and hugged her around the waist. Then she looked through the doorway toward the parlor table where the papers lay stacked. Is my $3 in there? Ethan touched his coat pocket. No, Your $3 stay with me. Still safe. Still safe. She smiled. Then the promise is safe, too. No one corrected her. Perhaps in a way, she was right. That evening, as the documents were gathered and the first contractors locked their tools away, Ethan stood alone in the courtyard for a moment. The lights in Street Mary's glowed warmly behind the windows. Somewhere inside, children were eating dinner with fresh fruit on their plates. Caleb's window no longer whistled. Grace and Annie walked home beneath the street lamp, hand in hand. Olivia was on the phone telling a reporter firmly that there would be no child interview. Daniel was already drafting the financial architecture that would make sentiment difficult to abandon. Ethan took out the envelope and held it in his palm. $3 had not repaired a roof. $3 had not bought oranges, paid doctors, hired counselors, or built a fund. But $3 had done something money rarely managed to do at any amount. It had told the truth. And now that the truth had been heard, Ethan understood the next step clearly. The promise could not remain hidden in folders in private meetings forever. It had to be spoken aloud, not for applause, but for accountability. The community needed to hear it. The children needed to hear it. Annie, who had stood at the gate with everything she had, needed to know that her small act had become something no adult in that room was allowed to forget. The announcement would not be made in a ballroom, not under chandeliers, not before donors sipping wine. It would happen at Street Mary's in the yard where Annie first held out her hand. No red carpet, no grand stage, just the children, the neighbors, the people who had stayed, and a promise strong enough to be made in the place where it would have to be kept. The decision to hold the announcement in the yard at Street Mary's changed the atmosphere of the entire place. It was not excitement exactly, at least not at first. Excitement was too simple a word for children who had learned that good news sometimes came with conditions. What moved through the orphanage over the next 2 days was something more cautious, more tender, and more complicated. The children whispered about chairs being set up outside. They watched Olivia measure space with Sister Margaret. They saw Daniel Pierce speak with a local attorney beneath the old oak tree. They saw Mrs. Alvarez argue with a bakery owner about whether donated cupcakes should count as dessert if the children had already been promised peach cobbler. They saw adults working, not posing, and that difference mattered even if they did not yet have words for it. Ethan insisted on keeping the gathering small. No national news crews, no glossy stage, no velvet rope. Olivia invited only the local paper, one community radio reporter, a few church volunteers, the repair crew, the medical team, former residents, neighbors, and the people who had earned the right to stand in that yard because they had stayed when staying was not convenient. Grace approved every mention of Annie. Sister Margaret approved every camera angle. Daniel approved every public number. Mrs. Alvarez approved the food, which she declared was more important than all three. No child listens properly on an empty stomach, she said, stirring a pot of chili in the kitchen the evening before the event. And grown-ups get sentimental when they're hungry, makes them promise nonsense. Daniel, who had stopped by to review final documents, looked up from his folder. That may be the most accurate financial warning I've heard this week. Mrs. Alvarez pointed her wooden spoon at him, then put it in your budget. I believe we did, Daniel said. She nodded, satisfied. Good. The children were given no script. Sister Margaret made that clear to everyone. They could attend if they wished. They could sit inside if the crowd made them nervous. They did not have to smile, wave, sing, hug donors, or tell anyone how grateful they were. Gratitude, Sister Margaret said, was not something adults should demand from children as proof that help had been properly received. Annie heard about the announcement the night before while Grace brushed her hair in the kitchen. The little girl sat on a chair with a towel around her shoulders, trying very hard not to wiggle. Will there be cameras? Annie asked. A few, Grace said. But they're not there for you. And nobody is allowed to bother you. Do I have to talk? No. Do I have to stand by Mr. Ethan? Only if you want to. Annie thought about that. Will Caleb be there? Yes. Then maybe I can sit by him. Grace smiled into her daughter's hair. That sounds just right. Annie looked down at her lap. Mommy. Yes, baby. Why are they calling it my promise if I'm not the one doing all the fixing? Grace set the brush down and turned Annie gently so they were face to face. Because you reminded Mr. Ethan to make the promise. But listen to me carefully. You are not responsible for keeping it. The grown-ups are. Annie frowned. What if they forget? Grace's eyes softened. Then we remind them. With paper, with our voices. With Sister Margaret, with Mr. Pierce and his money rules, and with Mr. Ethan keeping your $3 safe. Annie seemed to accept that, though not completely. I hope he doesn't lose them. I don't think he will. Across town in his hotel suite, Ethan was having the same fear in a different form. The $3 sat on the desk in their envelope while he read his speech for the 5th time and disliked it more each time. The words were polished. They sounded generous. They sounded responsible. They sounded exactly like something the old Ethan Whitmore would have delivered without trembling. He pushed the pages away. Olivia sat across from him, laptop open, shoes kicked off under the table, a paper cup of coffee beside her. You hate it. I hate that it sounds like me. That is usually what a speech sounds like when you write it. No, Ethan said, it sounds like the version of me who would have left after the first event. Olivia closed the laptop halfway. Then don't use it. There are numbers Daniel wants, stated clearly. State the numbers, then tell the truth. He looked toward the envelope. The truth is not flattering. Maybe that's why people might believe it. Ethan stood and walked to the window. The city below was quieting again, but he no longer trusted the comfort of distance. I don't want tomorrow to become a performance of humility. Then don't perform. Olivia's voice was gentle but firm. Be humble. There's a difference. He turned back. When did you become the moral advisor? When a child forgave me faster than I deserved. That made him smile, but only briefly. He picked up the envelope and held it in both hands. I keep thinking about what Grace said. Build it so somebody after you has to remember, too. That's what the structure is for. No, the structure makes it legal. I need it to be moral. Olivia thought for a moment. Then speak to the children first. Not the reporters, not the donors, not even the community. Speak to the children and let everyone else overhear. Ethan looked at her. That's what Annie did. Olivia said she wasn't making a statement. She was talking to you. The rest of us just happened to be standing there. The next morning arrived cold but clear. The sky over Street Mary's was pale blue and the winter sunlight made the old brick building look less tired than usual. Volunteers set up folding chairs in the yard. Not in perfect rows, but close enough for neighbors to sit together. Someone from the church brought coffee and large silver urns. Mrs. Alvarez set out trays of biscuits, fruit, and small cups of warm cider for the children. There were no velvet ropes, no professional backdrop, no red carpet. A simple wooden podium stood near the porch, and behind it hung the same banner from the first day. But Olivia had removed the corporate logo. Now it read simply for the children of Street Mary's. Grace arrived holding Annie's hand. Annie wore a simple blue dress under her yellow coat and the same worn shoes, polished as best Grace could manage. Her braids were neat, tied with blue ribbons Grace had found in a sewing box. Annie spotted Caleb almost immediately. He stood near the front with his red truck tucked under one arm, wearing a sweater that had been donated the week before, but already looked like his favorite thing. Can I sit with him? Annie whispered. Grace looked towards Sister Margaret, who nodded. Go on. Annie hurried to Caleb, then slowed before she reached him, remembering her mother's warnings about running. Caleb lifted one hand. You came, he said. I live next door, Annie replied. He considered that and nodded as if it was still worth saying. Ethan arrived without announcement. He wore a dark suit and overcoat, but no tie. In his inside pocket was the envelope. Daniel walked beside him carrying the final charter. Olivia carried no tablet this time. Only a small folder and tissues she insisted were for anyone who might need them, though everyone knew she meant herself. Before the ceremony began, Ethan walked to Grace. Miss Carter, he said, are you still comfortable with this? Grace looked across the yard at Annie sitting beside Caleb. Comfortable may be too strong a word, but yes, as long as you remember what we agreed. I do. She is not a symbol to be used. She is a child to be protected. Grace nodded. Then say what you came to say. Sister Margaret opened the gathering with a short prayer. It was not grand. She thanked God for warm hands, honest work, second chances, and children who still knew how to see. Then she stepped aside. Ethan stood behind the podium and looked at the pages Olivia had placed there for him. For one moment, the old instinct returned. Read cleanly. Smile at the right places. Pause for applause. Make the room comfortable. Then he looked at Annie. She was not looking at the reporters. She was whispering something to Caleb. Probably about his truck. Her feet did not reach the ground from the folding chair. Her yellow coat was buttoned crookedly again. Ethan folded the speech and set it aside. Olivia, standing near the porch, saw him did and lowered her eyes with the faintest smile. Ethan took the envelope from his pocket. This, he said, holding it up gently, is where I need to begin. The yard grew still. Inside this envelope are 3 $1 bills. They were given to me by a little girl who stood at that gate a few days ago and waited until she could place them in my hand. She did not ask for a toy. She did not ask for attention. She did not ask for anything for herself. She told me the children here needed help and she gave me everything she had. Grace reached for Annie's hand. Ethan looked at the children, not the cameras. I have signed checks with many zeros. I have stood in rooms where people applauded generosity because the number was large. But I am here to tell you that no gift ever humbled me like those $3. His voice caught, but he did not stop. Because those $3 told the truth. They told me that a child had seen need more clearly than the adults around her. They told me that kindness is not measured by what we give when we have plenty, but by whether we notice someone who has less, and they told me something else, something harder. He looked toward Street Mary's. They told me I had mistaken visiting for caring. A quiet sound moved through the crowd. Ethan continued, that ends today. Not with a speech, not with applause, not with a Christmas visit people remember for a week and then forget. Today, with the permission of Annie's mother and with the guidance of Sister Margaret, this community, former residents, doctors, teachers, and people who know how to make promises accountable. We are establishing the Annie Promise. Annie looked up at the sound of her name. Ethan's eyes softened. This is not a burden placed on Annie. She is not responsible for fixing what adults ignored. She reminded us, now we are responsible. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, relieved he had said it exactly right. Daniel stepped forward and handed Ethan the charter. Ethan placed his hand on it. The Annie Promise will begin with a $25 million restricted fund for St. Mary's Children's Home and the children it serves. It will repair this building, support food and nutrition, provide medical and dental care, fund counseling, strengthen education, celebrate birthdays and milestones, and help children prepare for life beyond these walls when they are old enough to step into the world. The crowd was silent now, not because they were unmoved, but because the number was too large and the promise too specific to become ordinary applause. Ethan looked back at the children. You should not have to wonder whether warmth is temporary. You should not have to wonder whether adults will come back. You should not have to earn care by looking grateful enough for a photograph. You are children. That is enough. Sister Margaret wiped her eyes. Caleb leaned toward Annie and whispered, "Does that mean birthdays?" Annie whispered back, "I think so." Ethan heard neither whisper, but he saw the movement and felt the meaning. He lifted the envelope once more. "I will keep these $3 as long as Annie and her mother allow me to, not as money to spend, but as a reminder to obey. And if I ever forget, I expect the people standing here to remind me." Grace nodded once. This time, when the applause came, it did not feel like performance. It started softly from the back, from Mrs. Alvarez and the church volunteers, then spread through the yard. Some people stood, some cried, some simply bowed their heads. The children looked around, unsure at first, then began clapping, too, not fully understanding the fund or the charter or the legal language, but understanding that something had been spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Annie did not clap at first. She looked at Ethan, then at the envelope, then at Caleb. "Your window's going to stay fixed," she said. Caleb smiled. "And maybe birthdays." Annie smiled back. "And maybe oranges all the time." For her, that was enough. For Ethan, standing before the old orphanage with $3 wrinkled in his hand and a promise now too public to abandon, it was only the beginning. The applause faded slowly, not because people lost interest, but because no one seemed to know what to do after hearing a promise that large spoken in a yard that small. The children looked from one adult to another, measuring faces, listening for the tone grown-ups used when something was only a ceremony. Sister Margaret remained near the porch steps with one hand pressed to her chest, her eyes bright but watchful. Grace held Annie's hand so gently that Annie could have pulled away, but she did not. Caleb stood close to Annie, his red truck tucked under one arm, his face serious as he tried to understand what $25 million meant in the language of a child. To Caleb, it meant a window that would not whistle cold air onto his bed. To Annie, it meant oranges more than once a week, birthdays with candles and maybe crayons for the children who liked to draw. To Ethan, it meant something heavier. It meant there would be no quiet retreat, no returning to New York and letting staff handle the rest. No allowing the moment to become a framed photograph in an annual report. He had made the promise aloud. The old oak tree had heard it. The children had heard it. Grace had heard it. Sister Margaret had heard it, and Annie's $3, folded in the envelope in his hand, seemed to hold him to every word. Olivia stepped to the side of the podium and gently guided the local reporter away from the children. "No interviews with minors," she said, her voice polite but firm. "You can speak with Sister Margaret after the children go inside. Mr. Whitmore will answer questions about the fund. Not about Annie, personally." The reporter, a woman in a brown coat with kind eyes, nodded. "Understood. I heard him." "Good," Olivia said. Then, after a pause, "Thank you." Daniel Pierce stood near the folding table with the charter, already explaining the structure to a retired pastor and 2 board members from a local community clinic. He spoke in his usual careful language, but something about him had softened. When one older woman asked whether the money could disappear if leadership changed at Whitmore Group, Daniel tapped the document with one finger and said, "Not if I do my job properly, and I intend to." Mrs. Alvarez took that as the official signal that feelings had gone on long enough without food. "All right, everybody," she called from the side of the yard. "Children first. If you are over 18 and not carrying a baby, you can wait your turn." That broke the tension in the best possible way. A few adults laughed. Children began forming a line near the long tables where chili, biscuits, fruit, warm cider, and cupcakes had been set out. No one had staged the food for photographs. The napkins did not match. The folding table leaned slightly at one end, but the food was hot, and there was enough. Annie stayed beside Grace, looking toward Ethan, then toward the food table, then back toward the envelope in his hand. Grace noticed, "You want to talk to him?" Annie nodded. Grace led her forward. Ethan saw them coming and stepped away from the podium at once. He did not make Annie come to him like a child approaching a principal's desk. He walked toward her and knelt on the grass, lowering himself to her height as he had done at the gate. "Hi, Annie," he said. She looked at the envelope. "You told everybody about the $3. "I did," Ethan said. "Was that all right?" Annie looked at her mother. "Grace said he told it the way we agreed. He didn't make it too heavy for you." Annie thought about that, then nodded. "Okay." Ethan held the envelope in both hands. "I want you to know something. These still belong to the promise you started, but I won't spend them. I'll keep them safe unless you ever want them back." Annie shook her head quickly. "No, you keep them. If you give them back, maybe grown-ups will forget." Ethan's throat tightened. "Then I'll keep them." Caleb stepped closer, unable to hold back his question any longer. "Mr. Ethan." "Yes, Caleb. Will birthdays really happen?" Ethan looked at him carefully. "Yes, every child here will have their birthday remembered. With cake. With cake. What if somebody doesn't like cake?" Ethan looked briefly at Grace, who covered a smile. "Then we'll find out what they do like," Ethan said. "Pie, cookies, ice cream, whatever Sister Margaret says is allowed." Caleb glanced at Sister Margaret across the yard. "She doesn't allow too much candy. She is wise. She says sugar makes Marcus climb furniture. That sounds like something we should respect." Caleb nodded gravely. "Okay, birthdays are good." Annie looked relieved, as if this answer had settled one of the most important parts of the entire fund. Sister Margaret came over then, her expression composed, but her eyes still damp. "Mr. Whitmore, the children are going to eat. After that, some of them may want to show you the library shelves we currently call a library. Though I warn you, it is a humble sight." "I'd like that," Ethan said. Annie brightened. "There's a book about a bear." "I know that bear," Ethan said. "I was forced to give him a voice." Caleb grinned for the first time that day. "It was a bad voice." "It was a developing voice," Ethan said. "It was bad," Caleb repeated. But now he was laughing. That laughter did something no applause could. It loosened the yard. Adults began talking to one another. Neighbors introduced themselves. Former residents hugged Sister Margaret. A church volunteer handed Ethan a paper cup of cider and told him with the confidence of a Southern woman who had survived enough men to fear none of them that promises made in public were easier to track. Ethan agreed. After the children ate, Sister Margaret opened the front doors and allowed small groups to walk through the building, not a tour of poverty. She made that clear. This was not a display. It was a way for the community to understand what would change and why. The first group included Ethan, Grace, Annie, Caleb, Olivia, Daniel, and Kesha, the former resident who had spoken about January being the hardest month. They stopped first at the small room that served as the library. It had 2 low shelves, a box of worn picture books, a few chapter books with cracked spines, and an old globe with several countries faded nearly white. Annie went straight to the picture books and pulled out the bear story. "This one," she said. Caleb pointed at Ethan. "Read." Sister Margaret raised an eyebrow. Again, Ethan accepted the book. "I see my reputation has become a public resource." Grace leaned against the doorway, watching as Ethan sat in the small wooden chair, knees too high, book open across his lap. Several children wandered in and settled around him. Olivia stood behind them, arms folded, smiling in spite of herself. Daniel remained near the door, pretending to review a page in the charter while clearly listening. Ethan read the first line in the bare voice. The children erupted in laughter. Annie laughed, too, a bright surprise sound that made Grace press her lips together to hold back tears for all the talk of money, repairs, funds, and futures. This was what she wanted most. Her child laughing without worry, surrounded by other children who were allowed, at least for a moment, to simply be children. When the story ended, Kesha ran her hand along the edge of the shelf. "This room saved me sometimes," she said quietly. "Even when there weren't many books. It was the only place I could pretend I was somewhere else." Ethan looked around the small room. "Then it should be more than this." "It should," Sister Margaret said. Annie looked up. "Can it have crayons, too?" Grace smiled. "Libraries usually have books, baby, but some kids draw stories." Kesha nodded. "She's right." Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel sighed as if adding another category to a multi-million-dollar plan were a burden. But his eyes were kind. "Books and art supplies," he said, noted. Annie looked pleased. As the afternoon moved on, people drifted back outside. The air had warmed slightly under the sun and the children played in the yard while adults folded chairs. No one rushed away. That alone made the day different. The event did not end when the speech ended. People stayed to carry tables, wash cups, talk to staff, and ask what was needed next week, not just what had looked good today. Near sunset, Ethan stood by the gate where Annie had first waited with her $3. Grace came beside him. "You did well today," she said. "I hope so. That wasn't a compliment people like you should collect too quickly." He nodded. "Understood. But you said the right thing about Annie." That matters. It was important to get that right. Grace watched Annie and Caleb chase the red truck down the walkway. She asked me last night what happens if grown-ups forget. What did you tell her? I told her we remind them. Please do. Oh, I will, Grace said. Don't worry about that. Ethan smiled. A few feet away, Olivia was helping Mrs. Alvarez pack leftover biscuits into containers. Daniel was speaking with Sister Margaret about the first board meeting. Caleb was showing Annie how his truck could roll over the newly tightened porch step without tipping. The day had not fixed everything. The roof still needed work. The boiler still needed replacing. The children still carried histories no money could erase. Annie still lived in a house where her mother counted dollars carefully. Grace still had work in the morning. Ethan still had to prove that his promise could survive difficulty, cost, and time. But as the last light settled over Street Mary's, something had changed. Not in the way a fairy tale changes with a single gift and a perfect ending. It changed in the way real mercy changes things. One repaired window, one honest apology, one protected child, one public promise, one birthday still to come. Ethan touched the envelope inside his coat. Annie's $3 remained there, safe and close to his heart, and for the first time since he had become a man whose name opened doors, Ethan understood that the most important door he had ever walked through was not made of glass or steel or polished wood. It was the old iron gate of Street Mary's, where a child had waited with almost nothing and asked him to finally become worthy of what he had. The first board meeting of the Annie Promise took place the following Monday in the old parlor at Street Mary's, not because it was the most convenient room, but because Sister Margaret insisted that anyone making decisions for children should do so within earshot of children. A conference room downtown makes suffering too tidy, she told Daniel Pierce when he suggested using Whitmore Group's Atlanta office. Daniel did not argue. By then, he had learned that arguing with Sister Margaret was like arguing with weathered stone, possible but rarely productive. Ethan arrived with Olivia shortly after breakfast. The yard was already busy. Workers were replacing cracked boards on the porch. A temporary fence had been placed around part of the playground where the old surface would be removed. In the kitchen, Mrs. Alvarez was arguing cheerfully with Denise Parker about whether oatmeal could be improved with cinnamon and raisins or whether children had a moral right to complain about raisins. From the dining room came the sounds of spoons, chairs, and a little boy insisting he had not taken anyone's banana, even though the banana in question was clearly in his hand. Street Mary's was changing, but it had not stopped being itself. That comforted Ethan more than he expected. Inside the parlor, Daniel had arranged documents in neat stacks. Dr. Price joined by video call. Dr. Reed sat near the piano with a legal pad. Kesha Moore, the former resident-turned-nurse, arrived in scrubs after a night shift and accepted coffee with both hands. Anthony Bell came in smelling faintly of engine oil, because he had repaired 2 bicycles in the parking lot before the meeting began. Grace slipped in last, still in her laundromat uniform, looking uncomfortable in a room where people had placed a printed name card in front of her chair. She picked it up and frowned. Community representative. Sister Margaret looked over her glasses. Would you prefer, Queen of Common Sense? Anthony laughed. Grace tried not to but failed. Ethan stood. Miss Carter, thank you for coming. Grace sat slowly. I'm here because my daughter keeps asking if grown-ups are still remembering. Daniel opened his folder. Then I am pleased to report that legally and financially we are making it difficult to forget. For the next 2 hours, the board reviewed the structure of the fund. $25 million would be placed in a restricted charitable trust. A portion would cover immediate repairs and urgent care. The rest would be invested to support long-term food security, medical partnerships, counseling, education, birthdays, staffing support, and transition services for older children. Quarterly reports would be public. Spending categories would require board approval. No promotional material involving children would be released without strict consent. The charter included Grace's language exactly. Annie Carter reminded adults of their responsibility. She is not responsible for carrying it. When Daniel read that line aloud, Grace looked down at her hands. Ethan noticed but did not call attention to it. After the formal matters, Daniel cleared his throat. There is one additional item Mr. Whitmore asked to discuss privately with Miss Carter, though it has been structured separately from the Annie Promise. Grace looked up. Privately. Ethan felt a rare nervousness move through him. If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you and Annie after the meeting. Sister Margaret can stay if you'd like. Grace's eyes narrowed. Is this about Annie being on TV? No. Is this about more reporters? No. She studied him another moment, then nodded. All right. The meeting ended near noon. Children passed the parlor door on their way outside, bundled in coats and hats. Caleb stopped when he saw Grace. Is Annie coming after school? Grace said. He nodded, satisfied, and ran after the others with his red truck under one arm. Grace watched him go. He asks that every day now. Sister Margaret smiled. Friendship is one of the few resources we have never lacked, though we sometimes run short on space to keep it warm. When Annie arrived that afternoon, She came through the gate carefully, as if still remembering the first day she had stood outside it. Grace had picked her up from the bus stop, and the two of them walked across the yard together. Annie's yellow coat was buttoned crookedly again. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders. The moment Caleb saw her, he ran over. "They're fixing the playground," he announced. "I saw the fence. It's not for keeping us out forever. Mr. Martin said it's for safety." Annie looked relieved. "Good." Grace touched Annie's shoulder. "Baby, Mr. Ethan wants to talk to us for a minute." Annie looked toward Ethan, who stood near the porch with Sister Margaret. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Ethan said immediately, walking closer. "You have never once been in trouble with me." Annie seemed to consider whether this was statistically possible, then followed her mother inside. They met in Sister Margaret's small office. It was a plain room with a wooden desk, 2 visitor chairs, a filing cabinet, a crucifix on the wall, and a window overlooking the yard. From that window, Annie could see Caleb showing another boy how the red truck could roll along the edge of the porch without falling. Sister Margaret sat behind the desk. Grace took one chair and pulled Annie close beside her. Ethan remained standing for a moment, then decided standing made the room feel too formal and sat in the other chair. He placed a folder on his knees. Grace looked at it. "That folder looks expensive. It is not meant to scare you. Folders from rich men usually come with conditions. This one doesn't." Grace leaned back, then talked plain. Ethan nodded. He liked that about Grace. She made dignity sound like a rule everyone else had forgotten. "Annie," he said, turning to the little girl. "Do you remember when you gave me your $3? Annie nodded. "You still have it?" "Yes." He touched his coat pocket. "Still safe." "Okay. You gave it to help the children here." "And it did, not because we spent it, but because it woke me up." Annie looked at her mother. Then back at him. Mommy said, "Grown-ups, we're supposed to already be awake." Grace closed her eyes. Sister Margaret looked down to hide a smile. Ethan accepted the sentence with a small bow of his head. "Your mommy is right." Annie nodded, pleased that the matter was settled. Ethan opened the folder. "I also know that you did not give those $3 to get anything for yourself. That is why I want to be very careful about what I'm about to say. This is not payment. This is not a reward for being poor. And it is not because anyone owns your story." Grace's face grew. "Still," Ethan continued, "I would like to create an education trust for Annie, separate from the Annie Promise. It would cover her school expenses, books, medical needs, tutoring if she ever needs it, college or trade school one day, and a savings account for her future. It would be managed legally with you in control as her mother, and with protection so no one can misuse it." Annie stared at him blankly. "What's a trust?" Grace did not speak. Sister Margaret answered gently, "It means Mr. Whitmore wants to put money aside so that when you need school things, your mother will not have to worry so much." Annie's eyes widened. "Like crayons." Ethan smiled. "Yes, like crayons and books and school trips. And someday if you want college." "But," Annie frowned. "College is far." "It is," Grace said softly. Ethan looked at Grace. "You do not have to decide today. You can have a lawyer review it. Daniel can explain every line. If you say no, nothing changes between us and Street Mary's." Grace's hands were folded tightly in her lap. "How much?" Ethan hesitated only because he did not want the number to land like an object too large for the room. "Enough to cover her education through college and provide a strong start afterward." Grace's voice was quiet. "That is not plain. $1 million placed in trust." Annie looked from one adult to another. The number meant nothing to her, but the silence did. "Is that too many dollars?" Grace put one hand over her mouth and looked away toward the window. Ethan leaned forward. "Miss Carter, I know it's a lot. I know it may feel uncomfortable, but your daughter gave me something I could not buy. I cannot repay that, and I won't pretend this does. What I can do is make sure her future is not limited by how exhausted you can survive being." Grace's shoulders trembled once. She pressed her lips together, fighting for control. "I don't want charity for my child because people feel sorry for us. This is not pity. What is it then?" Ethan looked at Annie. "Gratitude, responsibility, maybe justice." In a small way, Sister Margaret spoke softly. "Grace, accepting help for a child is not surrendering your dignity. Sometimes, it is protecting hers." Grace wiped her cheek quickly, almost angrily. "I work hard." "I know," Ethan said. "I have always worked hard." "I know. I don't want Annie thinking someone else saved us because I wasn't enough." Annie turned at once. "Mommy, you are enough." Grace broke then, not loudly, but completely. She pulled Annie into her arms and held her, rocking once the way mothers do, when pain rises faster than words. Annie hugged her back, confused but certain of her job in that moment. Ethan looked down at the folder, giving them privacy. After a while, Grace lifted her face. Her eyes were wet, but steady. "If we do this, Annie stays Annie. She still rides the bus. She still says thank you. She still learns to work hard. She does not become some rich man's project. She stays Annie. She stays Annie," Ethan said, "and I choose the school decisions." You do, and if I need someone to explain the papers who is not paid by you, I get that. Yes, Grace nodded slowly. Then I'll have someone look at it. That's all I ask. Annie wiped her mother's cheek with her sleeve. Does this mean you don't have to work 2 jobs? Grace gave a shaky laugh that turned into another tear. Ethan answered carefully. It means your mommy may have more choices. Annie looked at him. Choices.